Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into a world of sand, sweat, iron, and absolutely terrible career decisions. Imagine for a moment that you wake up, not in your bed, not with your alarm gently nudging you into the day, but on a thin straw mat in a stone cell that smells faintly of old leather, dried blood, and someone else's anxiety. The morning light is barely a suggestion, creeping through a narrow slit in the wall above your head, and somewhere outside, a man is already shouting. Not the soft, disappointed shouting of a manager in a Monday meeting. Real shouting. The kind that has been refined over centuries to extract maximum physical effort from unwilling human beings before breakfast. Welcome to the Ludus, the gladiatorial training school, and welcome to the single worst morning of your modern life. You probably won't survive this, and honestly, the odds were stacked against you from the moment you arrived. You don't have the calluses. You don't have the muscle memory. You don't have the psychological armor that comes from growing up in a world where violence is not only normalized but celebrated as civic entertainment. What you do have is a vague memory of watching a Russell Crowe film and a worrying amount of confidence in your own physical fitness. That confidence, dear listener, is about to be gently, thoroughly, and repeatedly dismantled. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. There is something deeply wonderful about knowing that someone in Auckland is drifting off to sleep at the same moment someone in Oslo is just making their morning coffee. And we are all, somehow, sharing this strange little journey together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is somewhere in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, and Rome is at or near the peak of its extraordinary, complicated, occasionally baffling power. The city itself is home to somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, depending on which historian you ask and how generously they are counting the suburbs. It is loud, dense, fragrant in ways both wonderful and catastrophic, and absolutely obsessed with spectacle. The Romans did not invent gladiatorial combat. Historians trace its earliest roots to Etruscan funeral rites, possibly as far back as the 4th century BCE, where combat between men was performed as a kind of ritualized offering to the dead. But Rome perfected it, systematized it, monetized it, and turned it into the most sophisticated entertainment industry the ancient world had ever produced. And you, through some combination of misfortune, debt, conquest, or genuinely questionable personal choices, are now part of that industry. Let's back up to this morning because the morning matters. The Ludus operates on a schedule that would make a military drill sergeant nod with quiet approval. You are awake before the sun has committed to the day. The straw mat beneath you is not uncomfortable exactly. You have slept on worse this week, but it is thin enough that every stone beneath it has made its presence known throughout the night. Your body aches in places you did not previously know had the capacity to ache. The backs of your hands, for instance. The space between your shoulder blades in a very specific diagonal line. The architectural region just above your left knee that you have started privately calling the problem area. You are not alone in your cell. Depending on the size and prosperity of the Ludus, you may share your sleeping space with one other man or 4 or 6. The men around you range from utterly terrifying to merely extremely intimidating, and the pecking order among them was established long before you arrived. You are, without question, at the bottom of it. This will be made clear to you approximately 11 times before lunch. The Ludus itself is a compound, a walled, enclosed facility that is part training ground, part dormitory, part prison, and part professional sports academy. The design varies across the Roman world, but the great Ludus Magnus in Rome, which sat immediately adjacent to the Colosseum connected by an underground tunnel, was an engineering marvel. A rectangular training arena surrounded by tiered seating where wealthy Romans could come and watch the fighters practice, the way a modern sports fan might attend an open training session for a professional team, except with more sand and considerably more existential tension. Your cell has a door. The door has a lock. The lock is on the outside. This detail, small as it sounds, tells you everything you need to know about your current legal and social status. You are, in the eyes of Roman law, infamous, a person stripped of legal standing and civic dignity. This applies whether you came to the gladiatorial life as a slave taken in conquest, a criminal condemned by the courts, a free man who sold himself into service to pay off debts, or, and this category is smaller but genuinely existed, a volunteer drawn by the promise of food, housing, medical care, and the slim but glittering possibility of fame. Historians still argue whether the proportion of volunteers versus condemned men shifted significantly over the centuries of the gladiatorial tradition, or whether the surviving records are too patchy to draw firm conclusions. What is clear is that by the height of the imperial period, all four categories existed, and all four found themselves on the same stone floor every morning. You pull yourself upright. Your fellow cell occupant, a compact, weathered man from somewhere in the eastern provinces whose name you have learned is something that sounds approximately like Drusus but probably isn't, is already awake and performing a series of deliberate stretches with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has been doing this for years. He does not look at you. This is not rudeness. This is just how mornings work here. Everyone is internal until the shouting starts. The shouting starts. It comes from the corridor beyond the cell door, and then the door opens and a guard, not a soldier exactly, more of an administrator of physical suffering, is already moving down the line, banging on frames and issuing instructions in rapid-fire Latin that you are catching maybe 40% of. The gist is clear enough. Now, the sun is not fully risen and the training yard is already filling with bodies. The training yard is the heart of the ludus. In larger schools, it is a rectangle of packed earth or fine sand, surrounded by a low wall or a colonnade, with weapons racked along one side and the infamous paulus, a heavy wooden post approximately the height and width of a human torso, standing at intervals across the space. The paulus is your new best friend. You will spend more hours of your new life striking the paulus than you will spend doing almost anything else. You will come to know its grain, its weight, its specific resistance, the way it vibrates slightly when you hit it correctly and the way your wrist screams when you don't. The paulus is endlessly patient and completely without mercy, which makes it an excellent training partner and a deeply unsatisfying conversationalist. The men filing into the yard around you carry themselves with a particular kind of physicality that you will spend weeks trying to understand and months trying to replicate. It is not simply that they are large or muscular, though many of them are. It is that they move with an economy, a deliberateness, as though every gesture has been subjected to cost-benefit analysis. Nothing wasted, nothing performed for effect. You, by contrast, are doing a kind of unconscious shuffling that marks you immediately and unmistakably as someone who has never needed to be efficient before. In a world where physical competence is the difference between a long and profitable career and a very short one, shuffling is not a great opening statement. Standing at the edge of the yard, watching the recruits file in with the detached professional assessment of a man who has seen everything twice, is the doctor, your trainer. Not a physician, though that title will become relevant later in ways you won't enjoy. The doctor is a senior gladiator or retired fighter appointed to oversee your education. He is the person who will determine what type of gladiator you are suited to become, who will design your training regimen, who will decide when you are ready to fight and when you emphatically are not. His word in this yard is absolute. His opinion of you, formed in the first 30 seconds of observation, will shape the next months of your life. His opinion of you right now is not flattering. You can tell by the way he doesn't bother to look away from you, which in this context means you are interesting the way a broken tool is interesting, not with admiration, but with the quiet calculation of someone figuring out what use can still be extracted from something suboptimal. A mainstream historical fact worth knowing at this precise moment. Gladiatorial schools were, by ancient standards, surprisingly well-resourced institutions. The lanista, the owner and operator of the school, had a significant financial investment in every body in that yard, and dead gladiators don't generate gate revenue. The food was structured, the medical care was real, and the training was systematic in a way that reflected genuine expertise accumulated over generations. You are not in a dungeon. You are in what is, for its time and context, a professional athletic facility. This does not make it comfortable. It does not make it voluntary. But it does mean that the people running it have a vested interest in keeping you functional, which is faintly reassuring at 7 in the morning when everything hurts. Here is the quirky detail that historians love and that you will find inexplicably comforting. Recent bioarchaeological analysis of gladiatorial remains, particularly a remarkable cemetery discovered in Ephesus, suggests that the gladiatorial diet produced a distinctive bone density profile. Specifically, gladiators appear to have consumed large quantities of barley and plant-based foods, supplemented with a calcium-rich drink that some researchers believe was made from wood ash or charred bone dissolved in water. They were, isotopically speaking, what food scientists might today call carb-loading vegetarians with an unusual mineral supplement regimen. The men around you, in other words, built their extraordinary bodies largely on porridge. This information will not help you this morning, but file it away. We will return to the porridge situation in considerable depth very shortly, and you deserve to be prepared. For now, the doctor is raising his voice, and the yard is snapping to attention with a speed that tells you the consequences of slowness are well understood by everyone except you. You fall into line approximately 1 beat too late, which earns you a look, just a look, flat and appraising, that somehow communicates an entire paragraph of professional disappointment in about 1/3 of a second. The morning drill begins. It is not, at first, what you expected. There are no weapons in your hands yet. That, you will learn, is a privilege earned through weeks of foundational work that has nothing to do with swords and everything to do with your legs. Specifically, your legs are apparently the problem. Roman gladiatorial training, like most ancient combat training, began from the ground up, not metaphorically but literally. Footwork was considered the absolute foundation of everything. Your stance, your ability to move laterally, your capacity to shift weight and direction without telegraphing your intention. These were the invisible architecture that everything else was built on. And your footwork, at this moment, is the footwork of a man who has spent decades on padded floors wearing supportive shoes with excellent arch support, which is to say it is soft, it is predictable, and it is going to get you killed if someone doesn't fix it immediately. The doctor fixes it immediately. Or rather, he begins the long, uncomfortable process of attempting to fix it, which mostly involves pointing at your feet with a short wooden staff and making a sound that transcends language barriers in its clarity of meaning. You adjust again. You adjust a 3rd time in a direction that turns out to be wrong in a different way from the first 2 adjustments. The man next to you, young, somewhere from the northern provinces, with the wide shoulders of someone who grew up doing actual physical labor rather than the simulacrum of it, has the grace not to laugh. He probably recognizes in your suffering a mirror of his own first morning, which wasn't so very long ago. By the time the morning's first session ends and the men are sent to wash at the compound's bath facilities, because yes, the Ludus had baths, another reminder that this is a professional operation with infrastructure, you have learned 3 things about yourself with uncomfortable clarity. First, your cardiovascular fitness, which you were reasonably proud of in your previous life, is adequate for the kind of exercise you were previously doing, which turns out to be a completely different category of activity from what is required here. You are not unfit. You are fit for the wrong thing. Second, the concept of pain that you brought with you into this yard was a concept built on a very limited dataset. You are currently updating that dataset at significant speed. Third, and perhaps most importantly, everyone in this yard has a story that brought them here, and every single one of those stories is more complicated, more textured, and more human than the word gladiator has ever suggested to anyone watching from the comfortable distance of 2,000 years. The man with the Eastern accent who stretches silently every morning. The young northerner who doesn't laugh at you. The older fighter near the back of the yard who moves with a terrifying precision that seems almost choreographed. Except it isn't choreographed, it's just mastery, which looks the same from the outside but means something entirely different when you understand what it cost. You are the newest, the rawest, the least prepared person in this yard. The stone cell, the thin mat, the locked door, the shouting that started before sunrise. These are not background details. They are your life now. And somewhere across this walled compound, past the training yard and the bath block and the equipment room, past the cells of men who have been here long enough to stop counting the days, there is an underground tunnel that leads directly to the largest arena the world has ever built. But that tunnel is for later. Right now, you have a date with the Paulus, and the Paulus has absolutely nothing pleasant planned for your afternoon. The bath block is not luxurious, but it is functional, and after the morning's first session you are grateful for it in the way that you are only ever grateful for running water after a period of serious doubt about whether running water was going to be available. You splash your face, you rinse your arms, and you stand for a moment in the cool, dim air of the washing room, letting your heart rate negotiate its way back down from wherever it has been spending the last 2 hours. A few of the other men move around you with the quiet efficiency of a practiced routine. No one lingers. The morning is not finished, it has barely introduced itself, and the next portion of the day is already assembling itself on the other side of the door. What is waiting for you on the other side of the door is food. In your previous life, the word food arrived with a pleasant constellation of associations. Choice, flavor, texture, the mild daily adventure of deciding between things you actually wanted to eat. Here, food is not an adventure. Food is a delivery system for specific macronutrients deemed necessary for the maintenance and development of a functional combat body, and it is administered with the same cheerful indifference to your personal preferences as everything else in this compound. You line up. You receive what you receive. You eat it. What you receive is barley. Not barley as a supporting character in a larger meal. Not barley as one of several grains on offer. Barley as the meal. Barley boiled into a thick, dense porridge that sits in the bowl with the self-satisfied solidity of something that knows exactly how nutritious it is and would like you to acknowledge this before complaining about the taste. It is accompanied by a portion of beans, broad beans or chickpeas depending on what the compound's supply chain has managed this week, and a quantity of vegetables that varies in both species and enthusiasm depending on the season. There is olive oil. There is, occasionally, a modest quantity of something fermented and salty that the Romans would recognize as a condiment and that your modern palate will identify as aggressively acquired taste. There is no meat. This is the detail that stops you mid-bite, spoon-hovering, brain performing a rapid reassessment of everything you thought you knew about how large muscular men who fight for a living are supposed to eat. Where you find yourself thinking with genuine bewilderment is the protein. Where is the grilled chicken? Where is the post-workout shake? The eggs, the lean red meat that every fitness culture you have ever encountered has assured you is the foundational requirement of building a powerful human body. The answer, as it turns out, is that the Romans had a different theory. Gladiators were known in antiquity by a nickname, horderii, barley men. The primary fuel source of the professional fighting class was not animal protein but complex carbohydrates, specifically the dense, slow-burning energy of barley grain supplemented by legumes for plant-based protein and that peculiar mineral drink, the ash water, the bone water, whatever its precise composition, that researchers examining the bones found in that Ephesus cemetery believe was drunk regularly to maintain bone density and replace minerals lost through intense physical training. A mainstream historical fact that genuinely surprises most people. Roman gladiators were, by the dietary standards of their time and by the evidence of their skeletons, among the best-fed people in the ancient world. Not the most gourmet-fed, not the most varied-fed, but systematically, deliberately, purposefully nourished in a way that reflected a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between food and physical performance, even if that understanding expressed itself primarily as an enormous bowl of barley porridge 3 times a day. You eat the porridge. It is, you must admit with some reluctance, filling. Aggressively filling. The kind of filling that occupies not just your stomach but seems to colonize the surrounding real estate and put up permanent structures. Within 20 minutes of finishing the bowl you feel as though you have consumed a small architectural feature. This, you will come to understand, is the point. The gladiatorial diet was designed to produce a specific body type, one that was powerful and durable but also carried a layer of subcutaneous fat that served a genuinely practical purpose. Fat beneath the skin acts as a buffer. It protects the underlying muscle and the deeper structures, the arteries, the organs, the essential plumbing, from the superficial cuts and strikes that were the most common outcome of gladiatorial bouts. A lean, aesthetically modern fighting body would bleed beautifully and dramatically from the very first exchange. The barley body bleeds less, hurts less from surface contact, and keeps functioning longer. The horderii physique was not an accident or a nutritional oversight. It was an engineering decision. Historians still argue whether the gladiatorial diet was primarily a practical performance strategy, or whether it also reflected the social and economic reality that plant-based foods were simply cheaper and easier to procure in bulk for a large training facility, and that the medical and performance justifications may have been, at least in part, a post hoc rationalization of what was essentially a budget decision. The truth is probably somewhere in the complicated overlap between those two explanations, as the truth tends to be whenever human institutions are involved. You eat your second bowl. Yes, there is a second bowl. The lanista needs you functional, and you have time in the relative quiet of the meal to look around the eating area and take proper stock of the community you have joined. The gladiatorial school is a small world, and like all small worlds, it has developed the intricate social textures that emerge when people are confined together under pressure. The men eating around you are not a monolith. They are not the interchangeable action figures that popular imagination tends to produce when the word gladiator comes up. They are individuals with established relationships, private jokes, professional rivalries, and the specific kind of forced family intimacy that develops between people who share danger and close quarters. There are men who have been here for years, whose faces carry the particular settled quality of someone who has made an accommodation with their circumstances. There are men who arrived recently, whose eyes still have the slightly unfocused quality of a person whose internal map of the world no longer matches the terrain. And there is you, with your barley porridge and your aching feet and your dawning realization that the portion of this experience that involves actual combat has not yet begun, and you are already comprehensively tired. The midday meal, when it comes several hours later, is a variation on the morning theme. More grain, more legumes, a different configuration of vegetables. The olive oil is generous today, which counts as a good day. You are sitting next to a man who has been at the Ludus long enough to have opinions about the olive oil quality, which he shares with the resigned expertise of a food critic who has accepted that the restaurant is never going to improve but cannot entirely suppress his professional standards. His name, as best as you can render it through the language barrier that sits between you like a polite but immovable piece of furniture, is something in the general vicinity of Sextus. He is from a coastal region. He gestures south when he indicates home, and he has been a gladiator for 3 years, which means he has survived 3 years, which means he is either very skilled or very lucky or some combination of the two that he is disinclined to analyze too closely. Sextus eats with a methodical thoroughness that you find yourself unconsciously mimicking. He does not rush, but he does not dawdle. He treats the meal as a task to be completed correctly, which is probably the most useful framing available given the aesthetic limitations of what is in the bowl. He notices you watching him and raises an eyebrow, not unfriendly, just inquiring. You gesture at the food. You make a face that you hope communicates something in the general range of, "This is a culinary adjustment I am in the process of making." He makes a face back that communicates, with remarkable clarity, that he once made the exact same face about the exact same food, and that the face eventually stopped being necessary, and that this transition took approximately 4 weeks, and that you should hold on. For weeks, you file this information away as something between a promise and a threat. There is one meal in the gladiatorial week that is different, and it is the meal that has become perhaps the most famous and most romanticized feature of the gladiatorial experience, despite, or possibly because of, its specific context. Before major games, the lanista hosted a public banquet for the fighters scheduled to appear. This feast was open to the public, who could come and observe the gladiators eating at long tables, studying them, speaking to them, pressing close to touch the arms of men they had seen perform in the arena. The food at this banquet was of an entirely different order from the daily porridge. Meat, wine, delicacies, the full expression of Roman hospitality applied to men who might, in some cases, be eating their last substantial meal. The atmosphere of these banquets, by all surviving accounts, was complicated in ways that resist easy summary. There was festivity, genuine festivity, because gladiators were celebrities and the public adored them with the full intensity that any culture reserves for the people it has decided to make into icons. There was also, present beneath the festivity like a bass note beneath a melody, the awareness of what tomorrow would bring. Some men ate with abandon. Some barely ate at all. Some talked loudly and performed confidence for the audience watching from the public side of the table. Some sat quietly in their own private weather. The public watched all of it, consuming the spectacle of these men consuming their meal, which is a loop of observation so neatly recursive that it almost feels modern. You will attend one of these banquets, but that is several weeks away yet, and you have to survive the daily rhythm first. The evening meal closes out the day's nutritional programming, and it follows the pattern you have now established as the baseline expectation: grain, legume, vegetable, oil. The ash mineral drink that you have decided to think of as a supplement rather than a beverage because this framing makes it slightly easier to get down. You have been told, through a combination of halting Latin, demonstrated mime, and the patient translation of Sextus, who speaks a secondary language that overlaps approximately 40% with what you know, that your diet will be adjusted as your training progresses and your body-specific requirements become clearer to the doctor. This is oddly reassuring. The system has a logic to it. You are not simply being fed whatever is cheap and plentiful, or not only that. You are being fed according to a protocol that has been developed over generations, refined by observation and outcome, corrected by the evidence of which bodies survive and which don't. The Romans did not have sports nutrition science in the modern sense. They had something older and in some ways more robust. Accumulated empirical knowledge, passed from trainer to trainer, adjusted by experience, shaped by the very concrete feedback mechanism of whether the fighters they produced lived or died. Here is the quirky detail that will follow you into your dreams tonight. Analysis of bones from the Ephesus gladiatorial cemetery found that the gladiators had significantly elevated levels of strontium compared to the general population of the region, which is consistent with high consumption of plant foods and that mineral supplement drink, but also revealed something else. Their zinc levels were lower than average, suggesting that despite the careful nutritional planning, the gladiatorial diet had specific micronutrient gaps that the ashwater supplement may have been designed, consciously or not, to partially address. The men who built the greatest entertainment spectacle of the ancient world were, on a molecular level, running on optimized plant fuel with a side of dissolved mineral compounds. The more you learn about Roman gladiators, the more they confound every assumption you arrived with, and the more the confounding makes a strange kind of sense. After the evening meal, there is a period of relative freedom. Not freedom to leave, obviously, the door is still locked on the outside, but freedom within the compound to rest, to socialize, to maintain equipment, to do whatever private things people do when they have been compressed by a relentless day and need to decompress just enough to make tomorrow possible. Some men sleep almost immediately, their bodies making the decision without consulting their minds. Some talk in small groups. Some sit alone with whatever interior landscape they inhabit in the quiet moments. You sit with your back against the warm stone wall of the yard, and you take inventory of your body with the systematic attention of someone who has recently discovered that their body is a much more complex and demanding piece of equipment than previously appreciated. Your hands are developing new textures in locations that were previously smooth. Your shoulders have lodged a formal complaint. Your feet, which bore the brunt of the morning's footwork instruction, have submitted a detailed memorandum outlining their grievances and requesting a review of operational expectations. You eat a small additional portion of beans that Sextus has, with wordless generosity, slid in your direction from his own allocation. You nod your thanks. He shrugs with the philosophical economy of a man who knows that your being functional tomorrow is in the compound's collective interest. Overhead, the Roman sky does what it always does at this hour. Turns colors that no city sky in your time ever quite manages, deep and clear and indifferent to everything beneath it. The stars, when they come in numbers that would stop you in your tracks in your previous life. In a world where light pollution has quietly stolen most of the night sky without anyone quite registering the loss. Here the sky is full, extravagantly, almost aggressively full. The Milky Way is not a rumor. It is a fact, spread across the dark above the compound walls like something someone spilled and couldn't be bothered to clean up. And it is, despite everything, beautiful. Tomorrow the Paulus is waiting. Tomorrow the doctor will have new adjustments to your footwork, new corrections to your grip, new creative ways of communicating professional disappointment. Tomorrow the bowl of barley will be there at sunrise, dense and earnest and nutritionally optimized. Tomorrow the locked door will click open before the sun is properly up and the shouting will begin again right on schedule. But tonight, for a few minutes, there is just the sky and the beans and Sextus sitting nearby with his eyes half closed, and the compound settling into its nighttime self, and the distant sound of the city beyond the walls going about its vast, complicated, luminously alive business, entirely unaware that you are in here, recalibrating your entire understanding of what a human body is capable of and what a human life can look like, one bowl of barley at a time. The second morning is harder than the first. This is the detail no one warns you about, and it is the detail that breaks a significant percentage of new recruits in ways that the first morning, for all its shock value, does not. The first morning has the protective coating of novelty. Everything is so new, so disorienting, so comprehensively outside your frame of reference that your brain is too busy processing the sheer volume of incoming information to fully register the physical distress. You are running on adrenaline and bewilderment, which turns out to be a surprisingly effective combination for getting through a difficult morning. The second morning has no such coating. The second morning arrives with perfect clarity. Your body has had exactly enough sleep to move from the numb exhaustion of yesterday evening into a full and articulate accounting of every single thing that was asked of it in the previous day. The straw mat feels thinner. The stone beneath it feels closer. The diagonal line of soreness across your shoulder blades has recruited allies overnight and is now part of a broader coalition that extends from the base of your neck to somewhere in the general vicinity of your lower back. And this coalition has opinions it is eager to share at considerable volume from the moment you try to sit up. You sit up anyway because the door is already opening, and because Sextus is already stretching with his customary unhurried precision, and because the alternative, remaining horizontal and being collected from the floor by a guard with no patience and a wooden staff, is not an option you are prepared to choose. This is, quietly and without ceremony, the first genuinely gladiatorial decision you make. You get up anyway. The training yard receives you again. The Paulus is exactly where you left it, which is obvious but somehow still feels slightly personal, as though it has been waiting. The doctor is at his position at the yard's edge, staff in hand, already watching the recruits file in with that same flat professional assessment. You notice today that his gaze moves differently across different men. A flicker of attention here, a brief sustained focus there, a complete glance away that somehow communicates dismissal more effectively than any expression could. When his gaze reaches you, it pauses for approximately 1 second longer than it paused yesterday, which you choose to interpret as progress and which probably means something more complicated. Today, the wooden training weapons come out. Not the real thing, not yet, not for months, and in some training traditions not until the doctor has seen sufficient evidence that you are not going to immediately injure yourself or someone standing nearby. What you receive is the rudis in its training form, a wooden sword that is, by design, approximately twice the weight of the actual iron weapon it represents. This is not an accident of manufacture. This is intentional. Training with an overweight weapon means that when you eventually graduate to the real blade, it will feel light in your hand, responsive and quick, your muscles already calibrated for something heavier. It is a clever system that reflects the same kind of accumulated practical wisdom as the barley diet. Not sophisticated in a theoretical sense, not derived from first principles, but correct in the way that things become correct when they have been tested against reality repeatedly over a long period of time. The wooden sword is heavy. This sounds obvious written down, but the experience of it in your hand is something that requires direct encounter to fully appreciate. It is not heavy in the way that carrying something heavy is heavy, a bag, a box, a piece of furniture. It is heavy in a directional, dynamic way, heavy with momentum and implication, heavy in a manner that changes as you move it, that pulls against your wrist when your grip is wrong and bites back against your shoulder when your mechanics are off. You are not swinging a weight. You are managing a system of forces that has opinions about how it wants to move and will express those opinions through your joints if you fail to negotiate correctly. The doctor demonstrates. This is the moment when you understand, on a level that goes below conscious analysis into something more immediate, what the difference is between a man who knows how to use a sword and a man who is learning. The demonstration lasts perhaps 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, the wooden weapon moves through a sequence of positions and transitions with an economy that makes it look effortless. Not because it is effortless, but because every unnecessary motion has been eliminated through so many thousands of repetitions that what remains is pure efficiency, the skeleton of the movement with all the unnecessary flesh removed. It is, in a completely unexpected way, almost graceful. The doctor is not a young man. The economy of his movement is not the explosive athleticism of youth. It is something denser and more durable, the competence of someone who has been doing one thing for a very long time and has arrived at a relationship with that thing that transcends effort. He stops. He looks at you. He makes a gesture that means, now you try. The first swing is too wide. The second is better in the width department but introduces a new error in the angle of the wrist that the doctor corrects with 2 fingers placed precisely on the inside of your forearm. Not forcefully, just indicating, as though your arm is a machine with a calibration dial and he is adjusting it. The third attempt incorporates the wrist correction but loses the elbow position that you didn't know you'd had correctly in the first 2 attempts. This is the particular comedy of learning a physical skill. Fixing one thing breaks another, and the process of integrating multiple simultaneous corrections into a single coherent movement feels, for a long time, like trying to rub your stomach and pat your head while someone keeps moving both your hands. A mainstream historical fact worth pausing on here: Roman gladiatorial training was not merely about producing men who could fight. It was about producing men who could perform. The arena was a theatrical space as much as a combat space, and the crowd expected not just violence but spectacle. Controlled, legible, emotionally satisfying spectacle. The fighters were expected to display their skill, to make the exchange between them readable to an audience that included everyone from military veterans who could parse every technical detail to ordinary citizens who simply wanted to feel the visceral excitement of 2 skilled men testing each other. The training at the Ludus therefore incorporated an element of presentation. The movements had to be not just effective but visible, not just efficient but expressive. You were not being trained to win fights in dark alleys. You were being trained to win fights in an oval of sand surrounded by 50,000 screaming people, and that is a different discipline in ways that will take you some time to fully absorb. The morning's training moves through several phases, each of which introduces new categories of physical difficulty. After the weapons work comes the grappling component. Roman gladiatorial combat was not purely a weapons discipline, and fighters needed to understand the basics of close-quarters control, the ability to manage distance and positioning when the gap between you and your opponent has collapsed to 0 and the sword is no longer the primary instrument. The grappling is overseen by a different instructor, broader and shorter than the doctor, with the specific physical signature of someone who has spent decades learning how to move large amounts of mass very quickly and precisely. He pairs you with the young northerner from yesterday, whose name you have now established is something you are going to render in your head as Marcus because this is easier and he seems unbothered by the approximation. Marcus is stronger than you. This is not a personal failing on your part. Marcus grew up doing actual agricultural labor in a climate that apparently builds the kind of functional strength that no gym has ever quite replicated. But it is a relevant operational fact when you are attempting to maintain a position against his attempts to move you out of it. The grappling instruction is not about fighting dirty. It is about geometry, the angles of leverage, the relationship between your center of gravity and your opponents, the points of contact where force can be efficiently transferred or deflected. The instructor moves around the pairs, adjusting, correcting, occasionally sighing in a way that communicates professional sorrow without requiring translation. Here is the quirky detail that makes this portion of the training unexpectedly interesting. There is growing scholarly evidence that some gladiatorial training incorporated elements drawn from Greek athletic wrestling traditions, the pankration in particular, which had been absorbed into Roman culture through the long process of Hellenistic influence. The Romans were comprehensive borrowers when they found something useful, and Greek wrestling theory, which had been systematized and taught in gymnasia across the Mediterranean world for centuries, offered a technical framework for close-quarters combat that the gladiatorial tradition apparently found worth integrating. So when the instructor adjusts your hip position and angles your foot to create a different leverage relationship with the floor, he may be drawing on a theoretical tradition that stretches back to the gymnasium culture of Athens. This does not make the adjustment less uncomfortable, but it does give it a pleasing historical depth. Historians still argue whether the cross-pollination between Greek athletic traditions and Roman gladiatorial training was systematic and intentional or whether it happened organically through the movement of people, Greek trainers, Greek fighters, Greek-influenced practitioners, through the broad and interconnected world of the Roman Mediterranean. The answer probably varies by region and by period, which is the kind of answer that is completely accurate and not at all satisfying. By the midpoint of the morning, You have sweated through your tunic twice, and your arms are exhibiting a fine tremor that you are choosing to interpret as adaptation rather than failure. The pause has occupied its usual portion of the session. You are becoming intimately familiar with the specific geography of its surface, the grain of the wood, the way the impact resonates differently depending on the angle and the speed and the precise distribution of force along the blade of the wooden sword. The doctor has corrected your footwork 4 times, your grip twice, your shoulder position once, and something about your eyes, the direction of your gaze during a strike, that you didn't know was a correctable variable until he made it one. The eyes correction is the one that stays with you through the afternoon. What the doctor was addressing, through the medium of pointing at his own eyes and then pointing at your eyes and making a gesture that clearly meant no differently, was the trained fighter's management of peripheral vision and focal attention during combat. An untrained person in a threatening situation tends to fixate, to lock their gaze onto the most alarming thing in front of them, which is usually the weapon. A trained fighter learns to maintain a broader, softer visual field, taking in the opponent's whole body rather than the specific point of danger, reading the telegraph of movement from the shoulders and the hips rather than waiting for the weapon to arrive and then reacting. This broader visual awareness is the difference between seeing a strike coming in time to respond and seeing it arrive. It is also the difference between a fighter who can be deceived by feints and one who cannot, because a feint that misdirects your narrow focus is defeated by a gaze wide enough to catch the contradiction between the false intention and the true one. You spend the afternoon trying to train your eyes as well as your hands, and it is, in some ways, the most disorienting part of the day. You have been using your eyes in exactly the same way for your entire life. The instruction to use them differently, to let go of the focused, specific, object-to-object attention that modern life rewards and replace it with something broader and more ambient, feels neurologically strange, like trying to hear differently or taste differently. Your brain keeps defaulting to its usual setting. The doctor keeps redirecting it. This is, you are beginning to understand, going to be the rhythm of your training for a very long time. Default, correction, and then somewhere in the distant future a moment where the correction becomes the default and you will barely remember what the old way felt like. The afternoon also introduces you to the running component of the training schedule, which is perhaps the portion of the day where the gap between your modern physical fitness and the requirements of the ludus is least humiliating. You can run. Not as far as the more experienced men, not with the same economy of movement, not without the slight forward lean and arm crossing that the instructor corrects on the second lap, but functionally, adequately, without drama. The running route circles the interior of the compound in a loop that takes you past the equipment stores, the bath block, the cells, and back to the training yard in a circuit that is long enough to be meaningful and short enough to be repeated. The surface is uneven in places, and the corners require the kind of quick directional adjustment that your footwork instruction is very slowly beginning to address. Running in the company of these men is a different experience from the solitary or gym treadmill running you are accustomed to. There is a collective rhythm to it. Not synchronized, not military, but shared, the breathing and the footfall of 24 bodies falling into loose acoustic patterns that are oddly calming. The experienced fighters run with a particular quality of settled attention, present in their bodies without being consumed by them, moving through the compound space with the comfortable authority of men who know exactly where they are and have made a working peace with it. The newer men, yourself among them, run with more visible effort, more conscious negotiation between will and body, more of that slightly desperate quality that marks the gap between deciding to do something and having genuinely internalized the ability to do it. Marcus runs near you for a stretch of the second lap. He says something in his language that you don't catch, but his tone is companionable. You respond with something that probably makes no grammatical sense but apparently lands in the right register, because he nods and picks up his pace slightly, which you interpret as an invitation and match, which turns out to be a mistake because his slightly increased pace is considerably faster than your slightly increased pace, and you fall back within 30 seconds, breathing hard, watching his broad shoulders pull away down the far side of the compound. You don't mind. There is something almost pleasant about being very clearly and unambiguously at the beginning of something, at the place where every day will necessarily be slightly better than the one before it, where the trajectory is entirely upward because the starting point is so comprehensively at the bottom. You are not good at this yet. You are not close to good at this. But you are better than you were this morning, and this morning you were better than you were yesterday, and the arithmetic of that, followed forward, suggests that the person doing this running in 6 months will be a substantially different physical entity than the person doing it now. Whether you will have 6 months is, of course, the question hanging over all of this. But the doctor is watching from the yard's edge as the runners come around, and when you pass him he makes no expression of displeasure, which in the economy of this place is functionally equivalent to a standing ovation. The evening comes in its slow Roman way, the light changing, the heat dropping, the compound moving through its end-of-day rituals with the comfortable predictability of routine. The porridge is waiting. Sextus has somehow acquired a small quantity of something herbed to add to the oil, and he shares this with the quiet magnanimity of a man who understands that small pleasures, carefully distributed, are the infrastructure of bearable days. You eat it slowly, tasting the herb thyme you think or something close to thyme, and the ordinary miracle of flavor in an otherwise functional meal lands with a disproportionate gratitude that tells you something about how quickly your hedonic baseline is recalibrating. After the meal, sitting in the courtyard's evening air, you look at your hands. The new textures are developing, not calluses yet, not the real ones, but the preliminary negotiations that precede them. Your hands are changing. Your feet are changing. Your shoulders, despite the formal complaints they filed this morning, are changing. The body, it turns out, is remarkably willing to adapt when adaptation is not a choice. It grumbles, it protests, it submits detailed memoranda of grievance, but it adapts. It has been adapting since the first morning you stood on 2 feet, and it will keep adapting as long as you give it enough barley and sleep and relentless repetition to work with. Tomorrow the Paulus will be waiting. Tomorrow the doctor will find new things to correct. Tomorrow the wooden sword will be heavy in your hand and your eyes will default to the wrong kind of attention and your footwork will need adjusting in the same places it needed adjusting today and the day before, and you will make the adjustments and fall into your mat at the end of it and sleep the sleep of someone whose body has been comprehensively utilized. And slowly, in the way that slow things happen, not dramatically, not with a moment you can point to and say, there, that was when, you will stop being the newest, rawest, least prepared person in this yard. You will just be someone who lives here. There is a moment, somewhere in your 3rd or 4th week at the Ludus, when you stop seeing the compound as a single undifferentiated space of difficulty and start seeing it as a world. A small world, walled and locked, operating on its own internal logic and governed by its own social laws, but a world nonetheless, with its geography and its history and its characters and its invisible lines that everyone knows not to cross and its spoken and unspoken rules that determine, on any given day, whether life inside these walls is merely hard or becomes something worse. This is the moment when the pecking order stops being an abstract concept and becomes a lived reality that you navigate every hour of every day. At the top of this world sits the lanista. The lanista is the owner of the school, the man, almost always a man, though there are scattered references in the historical record to female lanisti operating in the provinces, who purchased or contracted the fighters in his stable, who runs the financial operation of the school, who negotiates the contracts with the magistrates and wealthy citizens who hire gladiators for public games, who sets the terms under which his fighters live and train and perform. The lanista occupies a social position that is one of the more fascinating contradictions in the Roman world. He is, by the standards of Roman civic morality, a deeply disreputable figure. The lanista is classified alongside pimps and actors and others who profit from the display of human bodies for public entertainment, and this classification carries real social stigma. A lanista cannot hold public office, cannot sit in the reserved sections of the arena that are designated for respectable citizens, is in many formal respects a person of compromised civic standing. And yet he is also frequently very rich. And in Rome, as in most places and most times, being very rich has a way of softening the edges of social stigma in ways that make the stigma feel somewhat theoretical. Your lanista is a broad man in his 50s with the careful eyes of someone who has spent a career making financial assessments of human physical potential, and when he walks through the training yard, which he does perhaps twice a week at irregular intervals, with the unhurried confidence of a man surveying his investment portfolio, the atmosphere of the yard changes in a way that is not quite fear and not quite respect but contains elements of both. He does not speak to you directly. You are too new, too unproven, too far from the point of the financial operation that you represent a meaningful variable in. But you watch him watch the others, and you learn a great deal from the watching. The fighters whose performance he observes with particular attention tend to carry themselves slightly differently afterward. Not obviously, not in a way anyone would remark on, but with a fractional shift in bearing that suggests their position in the compound's economy has been subtly reaffirmed. The fighters he glances past quickly carry a different kind of weight. Below the lanista in the formal hierarchy, but far more present in your daily life, is the doctor, your trainer, the man whose corrections have been reshaping your body and your instincts over these past weeks. The doctor's authority in the training yard is complete and unquestioned. His word on matters of technique, readiness, and assignment is the final word, and the experienced fighters accept this not merely because it is the rule but because they have seen enough to know that the doctor's judgment is usually right. This is the authority of demonstrated competence, which is a different and more durable kind of authority than the authority of ownership or office. There are multiple doctors at a large ludus, typically one for each fighting style or class, since the technical requirements of a retiarius fighting with net and trident are comprehensively different from those of a secutor fighting with heavy shield and sword. We will get to the fighting classes shortly, in elaborate and somewhat alarming detail. For now, what matters is that the doctors form a kind of middle management layer in the compound's hierarchy, answerable to the lanista in matters of business, but sovereign in matters of training and preparation. Then there are the fighters themselves, and this is where the hierarchy becomes genuinely intricate. Among the gladiators, status is determined by a combination of factors that interact in complex ways. Experience matters, the number of fights you have survived, the opponents you have faced, the quality of the performances you have delivered. Victory matters, but not in a simple linear way. A fighter who wins all his bouts against mediocre opponents accumulates a different kind of reputation than a fighter who loses gracefully to a superior opponent in a contest that thrills the crowd. The crowd's response to you matters independently of whether you win or lose, because the crowd's response is what determines whether the presiding magistrate or the paying patron grants you the missio, the reprieve, when you are defeated, and a fighter who consistently earns the crowd's favor is a more financially valuable asset than one who doesn't, regardless of his win-loss record. A mainstream historical fact that reshapes the popular image of gladiatorial combat. The majority of gladiatorial bouts did not end in death. The evidence from surviving records, particularly the funerary inscriptions and mosaic victory records that have been found across the Roman world, suggests that death in the arena was the exception rather than the rule. Gladiators were expensive to train and maintain, and a lanista who allowed his fighters to be killed routinely would rapidly find his business model unsustainable. The killing was real, and it happened, and we should not sanitize it into something bloodless. But the theatrical and performative dimension of the combat meant that a well-fought bout that ended with one fighter clearly defeated but alive was often a more satisfying spectacle than a quick death. And the economics of the lanista system created a structural incentive to keep skilled fighters functional for as long as possible. This knowledge does not fully comfort you when you think about the sand, but it adjusts the calculation. Among the fighters, the veterans occupy the top of the internal hierarchy with a naturalness that needs no enforcement. Their status is legible in everything: the way they occupy space in the yard, the way newer men unconsciously adjust their trajectories to give them room, the way the guards treat them with a slightly different register of authority, the way even the doctors speak to them with a fractional increase in collegial respect. The most senior fighters at the ludus have a status that is, in some lights, genuinely extraordinary. They are slaves or legally diminished persons in the eyes of Roman law, confined within a locked compound, subject to the lanista's financial decisions. And yet within this compound they carry the authority of recognized excellence in a discipline that the most powerful city in the world treats as its primary entertainment. There is a fighter at your ludus. You will come to know him as simply the Gaul, because his actual name is either private or unpronounceable to most of the compound's inhabitants, who occupies a tier of the hierarchy that seems almost separate from the rest. He has been here for an indeterminate number of years. He has fought a number of times that no one agrees on exactly, but that the compound consensus places somewhere between 15 and 20, which is an extraordinary figure. He is not the largest man in the yard, nor the youngest, nor the most visibly intimidating. What he has, and what you gradually come to recognize as the thing that separates him from everyone else, is a quality of presence that has no single good word for it in any language you have, an absolute, inhabited stillness that does not read as passivity or resignation but as the very opposite, A person so completely at home in their own physical existence, so fully occupying the space their body takes up, that the usual nervous transaction between self and world has been entirely resolved. Historians still argue whether the social bonds formed between gladiators within the ludus should be understood as genuine community. Friendship, brotherhood, mutual care, or whether the confined and competitive nature of the institution fundamentally undermined the conditions for authentic solidarity. The surviving evidence cuts both ways. There are funerary inscriptions where gladiators refer to each other as collega, colleague, and frater, brother, using the language of genuine affection. There are also cases where fighters within the same school faced each other in the arena, though this was apparently considered bad practice by most lanisti and was avoided where possible, for reasons that were probably as much financial as humanitarian. What you observe in the daily life of the compound is something that feels more nuanced than either pure brotherhood or pure competition. The relationships between fighters have the specific texture of people who share an extreme situation and who have, over time, developed the unspoken understandings and private loyalties that extreme situations tend to produce. There is genuine care in evidence, the way an experienced fighter will spend 20 minutes after a training session working through a correction with a newer man who is struggling, not because anyone asked him to, but because he can see the error and knows what it costs. There is also the competitive awareness that is simply structural. These men may one day face each other, or be compared against each other for the same booking, or compete for the lanista's favor in ways that are not always decoupled from their daily interactions. You navigate all of this from your position at the bottom of it, which is in some ways the best position for observation. At the bottom, you are not yet a significant variable in anyone else's calculations. You are beneath the threshold of interest that activates competition or territorial behavior. People are, for the most part, simply proceeding around you the way they proceed around any new and improving element, monitoring without engagement, waiting for the evidence that will tell them what category you belong in. Sextus remains your primary point of social contact, and through Sextus you begin to piece together the compound's informal history, the alliances and antipathies that predate your arrival, the events that shaped the current configuration of relationships, the unwritten rules that govern everything from who sits where at meals to which section of the exercise yard belongs, by long-established tacit agreement, to which cohort of fighters. Some of this information is conveyed in words, haltingly, across the language gap that is slowly and unevenly closing. More of it is conveyed through demonstrated behavior. Sextus moving you in a particular direction in the meal queue, Sextus catching your eye when you are about to set your equipment in a location that turns out to have a prior claim, Sextus performing the small navigational services of someone who has decided, for reasons of his own, to invest a modest amount of social capital in your successful integration. You ask him once, in the halting combined language you have constructed between you, why he bothers. The question is genuine. You are not yet an asset to him, not yet in a position to reciprocate anything, and the social economy of the ludus does not obviously reward the mentorship of new recruits. He considers the question with the same methodical attention he brings to everything, chewing a mouthful of bread. There is bread today, a good day, and looking past you at the middle distance for a moment. Then he says something that takes you several days to fully parse through the language barrier, but which eventually resolves into something approximately like, everyone who is not new was new once, and someone moved them in the right direction in the meal queue, and the compound is small enough that the investment eventually returns with interest even if you can't see how yet. This is, you decide, a philosophy both pragmatic and quietly generous, which captures Sextus himself rather well. The guards occupy their own separate position in the compound's social architecture. Present, authoritative, but curiously outside the hierarchy of fighters rather than above it. The guards enforce the physical boundaries of the compound and maintain order in the manner of physical space and schedule, but they do not have authority over the training, the rankings, or the internal social world of the gladiators. A senior guard and the Gaul are, in terms of formal institutional power, in an ambiguous relationship where the guard's authority in one domain and the fighter's status in another do not map neatly onto each other, and both parties seem to have arrived at an understanding of this that avoids the question rather than resolving it. The medical staff, the compound physician and his assistants, occupy a position that is respected across all social layers, because the medical staff are the people who determine whether an injury ends a career or merely pauses it, and everyone in this compound has a career to protect. The physician at your ludus is a Greek-trained practitioner who treats the compound's fighters with a brisk, unsentimental competence that you find immediately reassuring. He has seen everything. He has opinions about everything. He will tell you those opinions in detail whether you asked for them or not, and the opinions are generally worth having. Here is the quirky detail about the medical dimension of the gladiatorial world. Archaeological evidence from several sites suggests that the standard of medical care received by gladiators significantly exceeded that available to ordinary Romans of comparable social status. The ludus physician was not treating patients out of humanitarian concern. He was maintaining an expensive inventory, but the effect for the fighter was the same: access to practitioners who set bones, sutured wounds, treated infections, and managed the long-term physical consequences of a combat career with a level of skill and resource that a free poor person in the same city could not have accessed. The gladiator, legally diminished and physically at risk, was in this particular way better provided for than a free laborer who broke his leg on a construction site and had no one with medical training to call. Roman society contained these contradictions without appearing to notice them, which is either deeply hypocritical or simply evidence that the categories of good life and bad life have never mapped neatly onto the categories of free and unfree, which is an uncomfortable thought that you can feel the ancient world pressing toward you across 2,000 years. You are sitting on an evening in your 5th week, with your back against the sun-warmed wall of the compound, and you are watching the hierarchy arrange itself around you with the specificity of something that has had a long time to find its natural configuration. The Gaul is at the far end of the yard, going through a private practice sequence that looks nothing like the standard drills and everything like a private conversation between a man and his own capabilities. Sextus is 3 meters away, oiling the leather components of his training kit with methodical care. Marcus is doing something complicated and vigorous with a training partner that seems to involve a lot of lateral movement and occasional collaborative laughter when one of them makes an error that both of them can appreciate. And you are here, 5 weeks in, no longer the newest person in the yard. There has been a new arrival this week, a young man from somewhere east of Greece who has the specific wide-eyed quality that you now recognize as the quality you wore when you arrived, and which you are fairly sure has been substantially replaced in your own face by something more weathered and calibrated. You are not yet good at this. You are not yet close to good at this. But you know where to sit in the meal queue, and you know which side of the yard has the prior claim in the afternoon, and you know the difference between the guard who will look the other way for 30 seconds if you need it and the guard who absolutely will not. And you know that Sextus takes his bread plain, and that Marcus has a superstition about the direction he faces during the evening meal that no one has explained but everyone accommodates. And you know that the Gaul's stillness is not emptiness but a kind of fullness so complete it has nowhere left to expand. These are the things you know. Tomorrow, the doctor is going to tell you what kind of gladiator you are going to become. You are not sure whether to look forward to this or dread it, so you do what the compound has been teaching you, in its relentless daily way, to do with every uncomfortable unknown. You set it aside for tonight, you eat your food, you watch the sky do its extravagant thing above the walls, and you let the question wait until the question becomes an answer. The doctor does not announce his decision the way you might expect. There is no formal ceremony, no gathering of the compound's population to witness the classification of its newest member. No speech. What happens is simpler and in some ways more unsettling. He watches you for 3 days with a slightly different quality of attention than usual, not the corrective attention of the training yard, but the assessing attention of someone constructing a mental dossier, and then on the 4th morning he appears at your shoulder during the weapons drill and says a single word that you don't immediately recognize, and then repeats it in a way that makes clear it is a category rather than an instruction, and then walks away to attend to something else, leaving you standing with your wooden sword and the sudden vertiginous sense of a door closing on one future and opening on another. The word is Thraex. You are going to be a Thracian. This news requires some unpacking, because the gladiatorial world contains a bewildering variety of fighter types that developed over the centuries of the tradition's existence, each with its own equipment, its own techniques, its own strengths and weaknesses, and its own particular relationship with the crowd. Understanding what a Thraex is, and is not, requires first understanding the broader taxonomy of the arena, which is itself one of the more fascinating organizational achievements of Roman entertainment culture. At the most fundamental level, gladiatorial combat was built around the principle of contrast. The most compelling bouts, the ones that generated the most crowd enthusiasm and the most lasting reputation, were fought between fighters whose different equipment and styles created a dynamic interaction, a visual and tactical conversation between different combat philosophies. The Romans understood, with the intuitive brilliance of people who had been producing mass entertainment for generations, that the most interesting conflict is not between two identical things but between two different things whose differences create tension, uncertainty, and the possibility of surprise. So the gladiatorial system evolved not toward a single optimal fighting style, but toward a curated ecosystem of contrasting styles that were matched against each other in pairings designed to maximize dramatic interest. The Thraex, your new identity, is one of the older and more prestigious fighter types in this ecosystem. He is equipped with a small curved shield called a parmula, which is considerably smaller than the shields carried by some of his frequent opponents, a visored helmet with a distinctive high crest, greaves on both legs, and most characteristically, a curved short sword called a sicca, a blade that curves backward toward the wielder in a shape that looks deeply impractical until you understand what it is designed to do. The curved blade is optimized for hooking around an opponent's shield to deliver a strike that a straight blade could not reach, a solution to the specific tactical problem posed by a heavily shielded opponent that reflects genuine ingenuity in weapon design. The Thraex fights with relatively light protection and a relatively small shield, which means he relies more heavily on mobility and technique than on the defensive bulk of heavily armored types. He is expected to move, to use the arena space, to create angles and exploit openings rather than to absorb punishment and wait for opportunity. This is either good news or bad news for you personally depending on your honest assessment of your own developing capabilities. And your honest assessment is that your footwork, while improved, is still not the primary weapon in your arsenal that it will need to become if the Thraex style is going to work for you. The doctor's choice, you gradually understand, was not arbitrary. He has been watching your movement patterns for weeks, cataloging your natural tendencies, your reflexes, the way your body solves the problems the training presents to it. The Thraex classification is not an assignment to a type you are currently suited for. It is an assignment to a type you are structurally capable of becoming, given sufficient development of the specific attributes, lateral quickness, spatial awareness, the particular technical application of the curved blade, that the doctor has identified as latent in your physical makeup. He is not telling you what you are. He is telling you what you are going to be built into. This is, once you understand it, simultaneously flattering and daunting. Now let us take a proper tour of the other inhabitants of this gladiatorial ecosystem, because you will fight some of them, and you will watch the rest, and understanding who they are and what they do will become as fundamental to your daily existence as the barley and the paulus. The murmillo is perhaps the most recognizable gladiatorial type to modern eyes, the one that closest matches the popular image. He carries a large rectangular shield, the scutum, fights with a straight short sword, and wears a distinctive fish-crested helmet. The murmillo is heavily protected and relies on that protection to absorb and deflect while creating the moment for a decisive thrust. He is the Thraex's most common opponent, and the pairing between them, small curved shield and sicca against large rectangular shield and gladius, is one of the classic matchups of the arena, refined over generations into a contest whose dynamics the crowd knows intimately and whose variations and surprises they are therefore equipped to appreciate at a level of sophisticated connoisseurship. The retiarius is the type that most challenges modern assumptions about what gladiatorial combat looked like. He carries a weighted net, a trident, and a long dagger, and he wears almost no armor. A single shoulder guard on the left arm, no helmet, no shield. His face is visible to the crowd at all times, which is significant both practically and theatrically. The retiarius' speed and range and the particular geometry of a net thrown correctly. He fights at a distance, trying to entangle his opponent and then close with the trident before the opponent can recover. When it works, it is spectacular in a way that has no real equivalent in any other combat sport. When it doesn't work, the retiarius is a nearly defenseless man with a trident facing someone who is now very close and very annoyed. A mainstream historical fact worth noting, the retiarius was, by surviving evidence, the least socially prestigious fighter type despite, or because of, his visual distinctiveness. Roman masculine ideals associated exposed faces and light armor with vulnerability in a way that read as unmartial, and the retiarius was sometimes the subject of a particular kind of crowd mockery that the other types did not receive. He was the showman of the arena, the crowd's favorite in terms of entertainment value, and simultaneously looked down upon by the social hierarchy that rated heavy armor and direct engagement as more properly martial. This contradiction contains a great deal of interesting information about Roman values, none of which helps the retiarius when the net misses. The secutor is the retiarius's designated opponent, evolved specifically to counter the net and trident style. His helmet is smooth and rounded with small eye holes, specifically designed to prevent the net from catching on protrusions, and he carries the large scutum shield. Fighting a secutor is the retiarius's greatest challenge because the secutor is designed, armor and all, as a counter-argument to everything the retiarius does. The matchup between them is therefore the most explicitly designed interaction in the gladiatorial system. Two fighter types evolved in explicit relationship to each other, like a lock and a key that were manufactured simultaneously. The hoplomachus resembles Greek heavy infantry equipment, a round shield, a spear, and a short sword as backup, and represents the Roman arena's incorporation of Greek martial aesthetics into its entertainment system. The provocator fights with a chest plate and a curved shield and is one of the types that fights exclusively against other provocateurs, which makes him unusual in the ecosystem. The scissor, and here is your quirky detail for this portion of the journey, carried on one arm a tubular armor sleeve capped with a semicircular rotating blade that replaced the conventional sword, creating a weapon that was part shield, part cutting implement, and entirely terrifying to look at. The scissor is one of the more extreme expressions of the Roman entertainment industry's appetite for novelty and visual impact, and represents what happens when a system that has been producing spectacle for generations starts looking for ways to refresh its own vocabulary. Historians still argue whether the full variety of gladiatorial types existed simultaneously throughout the history of the games or whether different types dominated in different periods, with some falling out of fashion and others being invented in response to changing crowd tastes. The gladiatorial system was not static. It evolved over roughly 7 centuries of practice, and the types that fought in the Republic were not identical to the types that fought under the later empire, and the regional variations across a Mediterranean world that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia add further complexity to any attempt to describe the gladiatorial tradition as a single coherent thing. What you are inheriting, in other words, is not a fixed system but a living tradition that has been continuously revised by the feedback of crowd response and the creativity of practitioners across centuries. Your Thraex training now intensifies and specializes. The wooden sicca arrives, curved, heavy, strange in your grip in a way that the straight training sword was not. The curve changes everything about the mechanics of a strike. The trajectory, the angle of the wrist, the relationship between the blade's movement and the target you are aiming for. You have spent weeks learning to use a straight weapon with something approaching competence, and the arrival of the curved one feels like being told that everything you learned about driving applies to a vehicle that steers from the back. The doctor watches your first attempts with the expression of a man who has seen this particular adjustment many times and has calibrated his patience accordingly. The parmula, your small shield, is also a revelation, and not an entirely welcome one. After watching the larger shields carried by Murmillo and Secutor fighters, the parmula feels almost insultingly inadequate. It covers a fraction of what the big shields cover. It offers protection to a carefully selected region of your body and essentially declines to comment on the rest. What it offers instead is mobility. The lighter load lets you move in ways the heavily shielded types cannot, change direction faster, present a smaller and more mobile target. Intellectually, this trade-off makes sense. Experientially, standing opposite a training partner carrying a large scutum with your small parmula between you, it requires a specific act of will to trust the theory over the instinct. Your specific opponent pairing, as a Thraex, will most frequently be against the Murmillo. This pairing has been refined by centuries of practice into something almost symbiotic. The two styles complement and challenge each other in ways that produce consistently compelling contests. The Murmillo's large shield forces you to find angles and use the curve of the sicca to work around it. Your mobility forces the Murmillo to turn and adjust constantly, creating the openings that his own armor's weight makes difficult to recover from quickly. It is, at its best, a contest of patience and cleverness against endurance and positioning, and the crowd, which has watched this matchup hundreds of times, reads every exchange with an expertise that would shame a modern sports commentator. You begin practicing against a training Murmillo Marcus, as it happens, who has been classified into that type with a naturalness that, looking at his broad shoulders and natural affinity for the large shield, seems obvious in retrospect. The first time you face him in a dedicated pairing drill, the gulf between his developed competence and your new-to-the-style limitations is immediately and comprehensively apparent. He is patient with this. More than patient, he is genuinely useful as a training partner because his consistent, reliable execution of the Murmillo style gives you a fixed point to work against, a stable problem whose parameters you can study and begin to address methodically. The doctor watches your early pairing drills with the focused attention he reserves for situations where the evidence is coming in fast. He corrects your use of the Sika constantly in these early sessions, the angle of the hook, the moment of commitment, the recovery position after a strike that doesn't connect. He is teaching you the Thraex style not as a collection of techniques but as a coherent philosophy, a way of solving the problem of the Murmillo that has been developed over generations by men who encountered the same problem and recorded their solutions in the living tradition of the style itself. There is something humbling and extraordinary about this. You are receiving knowledge that has been passed from fighter to fighter across centuries, encoded not in books but in bodies, transmitted not through text but through the doctor's hands on your wrist and the accumulated corrections of 1,000 training sessions. The Thraex style that you are beginning to learn is older than most of the buildings you can see from the compound walls. It has outlived the individual men who developed it and the men who refined it, and it exists now in the compound's practice as a kind of living archaeology of human problem-solving under extreme conditions. The afternoons that follow your classification take on a new shape. The general drills continue, the running, the Paulu's work, the grappling, but overlaid on them now is the specialized curriculum of the Thraex, and this specialization gives your training a new sense of direction and identity. You are no longer simply a recruit being subjected to a general program of development. You are a Thraex in formation, and the distinction matters more than you expected it to. You practice the Sika hook until the curve of the blade stops feeling foreign and starts feeling intentional. You practice with the parmula until its smallness stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like a specific kind of freedom. You practice footwork, always footwork, the doctor's great obsession, in the particular patterns that the Thraex style requires, the lateral cuts and the angular repositions and the retreating step that creates the distance needed to set up the hook. And slowly, in the way that slow things happen, a style begins to emerge. Not a good style yet. Not a finished or reliable or arena-ready style. But a style, a recognizable approach, a coherent response to the problem of the Murmillo, a set of tendencies and preferences that are becoming yours in the same way that your handwriting is yours, not consciously chosen, but shaped by the intersection of instruction and individual character into something that, if you looked at it alongside 100 other Thraex fighters, would be identifiably, specifically you. Sextus, watching you practice one evening from his customary position against the wall, says something that resolves through the language gap into something approximately like, "You look less like someone about to hurt themselves." He means it as a compliment, and you receive it as one because in the economy of this compound, less like someone about to hurt themselves is genuinely progress. The notification comes on a Tuesday, or what passes for Tuesday in a world that measures its week differently from yours. A day that the compound marks not by name but by the subtle shift in atmosphere that travels through the ludus like a change in air pressure before a storm. The games are in 12 days. Your name is on the list. You find this out the way most things are found out in the compound, not through a formal announcement directed at you personally, but through the information arriving in your vicinity via Sextus, who has it from one of the senior fighters, who has it from a guard, who has it from the administrative apparatus of the Lannistus household, which has been in negotiations with the game's organizer for the better part of a month. The chain of transmission is efficient in the way that information always becomes efficient in closed communities where knowledge is the primary social currency. By the time you know, everyone knows, and the compound has already begun its quiet reorganization around the fact. 12 days. You sit with this number for a long moment, turning it over, testing its weight. 12 days ago, you were still making the transition from general recruit to Thraex specialist. 12 days from now, you will be standing on sand in front of a crowd whose size you can barely conceptualize, holding a curved sword that you are becoming competent with but have not yet mastered. facing an opponent whose name and record and specific fighting tendencies you do not yet know. The rational part of your brain, the part that has been recalibrating steadily since your first morning in the compound, assembles the available evidence and reaches a measured conclusion. You are not ready. You know you are not ready because the doctor himself, when he included you on the roster, did so with a qualifier, conveyed through Sextus's translation and the doctor's own brief direct look, that suggested this was a developmental bout, an early exposure, the first chapter of a career rather than a test of its current peak. He is not sending you to win a legendary victory. He is sending you to begin. These are meaningfully different things, and the distinction matters for how the next 12 days should be spent. The compound's pre-games atmosphere is one of the things that no historical account quite prepares you for, because it is not a single emotion but a layered, shifting, complicated emotional climate that different people inhabit in different ways simultaneously. For the veterans, the fighters with multiple appearances behind them, for whom the arena is a known quantity even if never entirely a comfortable one, the approach of games produces a tightening of focus rather than a disruption of routine. They train harder and with more specific intention. They sleep more deliberately. They eat with the particular attention of someone who is managing a machine they know well and want to have performing at its best on a specific date. For the newer fighters, for you, the 12 days have a different texture. The focus is there, or you reach for it, but underneath the focus is something that sits in the body rather than the mind, something that wakes up before you do in the morning and is already waiting when you open your eyes. It is not precisely fear, though fear is part of it. It is more like the heightened reality of a situation that has stopped being theoretical and become actual, the specific quality of aliveness that arrives when consequences are no longer abstract. The training in these 12 days is modified. There is more rest built into the schedule. The doctor understands that the body needs time to consolidate what it has learned, that training too hard in the final days before a bout produces a fighter who is physically depleted rather than sharpened. The technical work becomes more refined and less exploratory. You are not learning new things now but polishing what you have, smoothing the rough edges, making your responses more automatic and your decision-making faster. The Palu sessions have a different quality. You are not hitting to learn anymore, you are hitting to confirm. Your pairing drills with Marcus take on a new seriousness that both of you recognize and neither of you comments on. Marcus is not on the game's roster. His classification is settled, but the doctor has decided he needs more time, a judgment Marcus accepts with the equanimity that you suspect costs him more than it shows. He trains against you with full engagement, bringing everything he has to the sessions, because training you well is the thing he can do, and he does it with the commitment of someone who takes the work seriously regardless of whether the work directly serves his own immediate interests. This is the compound's ethic in its best expression, and you understand it now in a way you couldn't have in your first week. The night rituals begin to matter in new ways. Every fighter in this compound has a private relationship with the spiritual dimension of what they do. The Roman world is not a secular world. It is saturated with divine presence and religious obligation, with gods and spirits and the ritual requirements of maintaining right relationship with powers that are understood to be genuinely operative in human affairs. The gladiator lives at an intersection where religious attention is particularly concentrated. He is someone who regularly encounters the possibility of death, who works in an institution with its own religious traditions and obligations, who performs in a space, the arena, that is in some sense sacred, connected to the funeral games from which the gladiatorial tradition originally descended. The compound has its own shrine, a modest affair in a corner of the courtyard where small offerings accumulate in a way that suggests regular and sincere use rather than performative piety. The gods represented there reflect the compound's demographic diversity. Alongside the standard Roman pantheon, there are offerings that suggest Syrian, Egyptian, and Germanic religious traditions, the whole Mediterranean world's spiritual vocabulary compressed into a small courtyard shrine that somehow accommodates all of it. You add something to the shrine on the evening of the notification day, following an instinct that surprises you with its strength. You are not, in your previous life, a particularly religious person. But the compound has been teaching you, in its persistent way, that the categories you arrived with are not always adequate to the situations you now inhabit. A mainstream historical fact that gives this moment its proper context. The gladiatorial games in Rome were not simply entertainment. They were munera, literally, obligations or duties, Originally presented as part of funeral commemorations for important Romans, a way of honoring the dead through the offering of blood and the demonstration of virtus, the specifically Roman complex of martial virtue and excellence. By the imperial period, the connection to funeral practice had become largely nominal, and the games were primarily public entertainments organized by magistrates and wealthy citizens as a form of political generosity to the people. But the ritual dimension never entirely disappeared. The arena retained a sacred quality. The gladiators' performance retained its connection to older ideas about sacrifice and offering, and the crowd's relationship to the spectacle retained something of the religious intensity of an audience participating in a ritual rather than simply watching a show. This means that your pre-fight spiritual attention is not eccentric or personal. It is structurally appropriate to the situation in a way that the Roman world would understand and expect. The night before the games, the public banquet arrives exactly as Sextus described it would, and the reality of it exceeds the description in ways that are both wonderful and deeply strange. The Lannistas household has transformed one of the compound's larger spaces into a banquet hall, with long tables and actual tablecloths and food that arrives in quantities and varieties that seem almost hallucinatory after weeks of barley and beans. There is roasted meat, pork and lamb, sending aromas through the space that your body responds to with a Pavlovian enthusiasm that bypasses conscious thought entirely. There is bread of multiple kinds, actual wine rather than the diluted daily ration, fruits and preserved things, and a honey-based sweet that one of the fighters near you demolishes with the focused pleasure of a man who has been waiting for this specific experience for a very long time. And there is the public. This is the part that Sextus's description did not fully prepare you for. The civilians who have been admitted to observe the banquet, who line the edges of the space and lean in from the doorways, who press forward to touch the arms of the fighters they recognize from previous appearances, who speak to the veterans with the particular mixture of reverence and familiarity that celebrity generates in any culture. They are citizens of all descriptions, prosperous merchants and their families, soldiers on leave, craftsmen, slaves accompanying their owners, young men who follow the games with the statistical obsession of modern sports fans and can cite the records and styles of every fighter in the compound with encyclopedic precision. They look at you with the assessing curiosity reserved for new additions to a roster, estimating, speculating, already making the mental calculations about your potential that the market of arena reputation is constantly conducting. Someone near the door points you out to a companion and says something you don't catch. You are, for the first time in your life, an object of genuine public interest, and the feeling is complicated. There is a component of it that is not entirely unpleasant, a warmth that comes from being seen and anticipated. There is also a component that is actively disorienting, a reminder that tomorrow you will perform in front of thousands of people who have this same quality of interested, appraising attention, multiplied by a factor that your current social experience does not have the reference points to process. The Gaul eats at the far end of the table with the same settled self-containment he brings to everything. He has attended many of these banquets. He has sat at this table in configurations that included men who did not survive the following day's sand, and he has continued to sit at this table afterward, which is either evidence of his exceptional psychological resilience or evidence of a relationship with mortality so thoroughly worked through that it no longer requires the protective processing that most people need. Probably both. You watch him accept a portion of lamb from a serving vessel with the same unhurried attention he brings to the morning stretches, and you find this oddly calming, the consistency of a person who is entirely themselves in every situation, without excess performance or withdrawal. Here is the quirky detail that surfaces in your mind as the banquet progresses. There is a story preserved in Roman sources about a group of gladiators at one of these pre-fight banquets who, when a philosopher was brought in to address them on the subject of death and how to face it with equanimity, listened with polite attention and then asked, very practically, whether the philosophy in question would make them faster. The story is probably apocryphal, or at least improved in the retelling, but it captures something genuine about the gladiatorial relationship with the enormous philosophical questions that their lives insistently raised. The existential dimension was present, but the operational dimension was always more immediate. You eat the lamb. You eat it slowly, tasting it with the attention it deserves, not performing gratitude for the audience at the edges of the room but genuinely, privately appreciating the flavor in a way that the barley porridge has, through its reliable unloveliness as a dining experience. made possible. Historians still argue whether the pre-fight banquet was experienced primarily as a celebration or as a ritual of farewell, whether the food and the public attention were genuinely festive or whether they carried the specific quality of a last meal tradition, the heightened presence of things fully appreciated because they might be the last of their kind. The answer is almost certainly both simultaneously, experienced in different proportions by different men on different nights, and the coexistence of celebration and dread at the same table is not a contradiction the Romans would have found difficult to hold. They were better than most cultures at containing multitudes without needing to resolve them. After the banquet, the compound settles into its pre-fight night configuration, which is quieter than the usual evening quiet in a way that is not peaceful but suspended. The silence of things gathered and waiting rather than the silence of things at rest. You lie on your mat in the dark and you do the thing that your mind insists on doing despite every practical argument against it. You run the bout in your imagination, over and over, working through the variables, the angles, the moments where your training tells you one thing and your uncertainty suggests another. The opponent. You have been told his name. A fighter from another ludus, 3 bouts on his record, 2 victories and 1 loss that ended in a reprieve. He is a murmillo, which is what you expected, which should be reassuring because you have trained for nothing else for weeks, and which is not entirely reassuring because training for something and doing it in front of 50,000 people are related activities that nevertheless belong to different categories of reality. Your equipment is ready. It has been checked and rechecked by the compound's armorer, a meticulous craftsman whose relationship with the gear he maintains has the character of genuine personal investment. The helmet adjusted to your head's specific geometry, the greaves fitted to your leg measurements, the parmula strapped and balanced, the sicca examined and approved. Tomorrow morning it will be waiting for you in the equipment room, and when you put it on you will become something other than yourself, something that the training has been building toward and that tomorrow will have its first real test. You close your eyes and you listen to the compound breathe around you, the breathing and the shifting and the private preparations of men in different stages of their own pre-fight processes. Sextus is 3 cells away and you cannot hear him, but you know he is awake, because he is always awake the night before games, lying still with his eyes open, not anxious exactly but present in a specific way that the darkness and the proximity of the arena demands. The fan of the city reaches you even here. Distant sounds, the movement of a million lives proceeding through their night, entirely unaware that in this compound, in these cells, men are lying awake in the dark with their equipment ready and their bodies prepared and their minds doing what minds do when the morning is 12 hours away and the sand is real and the crowd is real and everything that has been theoretical for months is about to become the most concrete thing you have ever experienced. The barley, you think, and this is the thought that finally carries you towards sleep, which tells you something about how thoroughly the compound has recalibrated your inner life. The barley was good today. Slightly less gluey than usual, almost in its stolid and dependable way, comforting. Tomorrow the sand. Tonight the barley and the dark and the breathing of the compound, and somewhere above the walls, the extravagant stars doing their nightly work with the serene indifference of things that have been at it for much longer than any of this. The morning arrives without drama, which is somehow worse than if it had arrived with some. You had half expected the day to announce itself differently. A change in the quality of the light, a shift in the compound's acoustic signature, some atmospheric acknowledgement of the fact that today is not a training day. Instead, the door opens at the same time it always opens, the shouting in the corridor has the same cadence it always has, and the straw mat releases you into the same stone-floored reality it releases you into every morning. The world has not adjusted its presentation for your benefit. This is either a reassuring sign of continuity or a mildly insulting indication that the universe considers today unremarkable. You decide not to pursue this line of thinking. The morning meal is lighter than usual, the doctor's instruction, followed without comment by the compound's kitchen, which has been feeding fighters before games long enough to understand the protocol. You eat what is given, which is less barley than usual and more of the flatbread that the compound produces on special occasions, and you drink water rather than the mineral supplement because the supplement's density is not what the body wants in the hours before sustained physical exertion. Around you, the fighters scheduled for today's games eat with various expressions of internalized focus, and the fighters not scheduled eat with the particular quality of attention that people bring to watching others prepare for something significant, present, respectful, not intruding. Then you collect your equipment and you descend. The underground passage that connects the Ludus Magnus to the Colosseum is approximately 250 meters long, and walking it for the first time is an experience that reorganizes something in your understanding of what you are doing and where you are doing it. The tunnel is vaulted stone, lit at intervals by oil lamps whose light is warm and insufficient, casting everything in the amber half-dark of a space that has been carved beneath the surface of the world and knows it. The air is cooler than the morning air above, and carries a dampness that suggests proximity to the underground water management systems that the Romans built beneath their city with the same systematic ambition they brought to everything else. Your footsteps and the footsteps of the men around you produce a sound that the tunnel's acoustics multiply and return to you slightly altered. More resonant, more present, more like the sound of something that matters. The hypogeum, the underground complex beneath the arena floor, is where the tunnel delivers you, and it is nothing like what the tunnel prepared you for, because the tunnel is simple and purposeful and the hypogeum is neither of these things. It is vast. It is a labyrinth of corridors and chambers and shafts that extends beneath the entire footprint of the arena above. A subterranean city whose population on a games day includes fighters, animals, animal handlers, stagehands, mechanical operators, guards, physicians, priests, administrative officials, and the various specialists required to run what is, in operational terms, the most complex live-event production infrastructure in the ancient world. The Colosseum's hypogeum, to use the building that most people picture when they imagine this space, even though the games were held in many venues across the Roman world, was completed under the Emperor Domitian in the 80s CE, replacing an earlier arrangement that had used the arena floor itself for storage and preparation. The new underground system was an engineering achievement that still impresses specialists who study it. A network of two-level corridors arranged in concentric rings connected by radial passages, containing over 30 vertical shafts equipped with counterweight elevator systems that could raise animals, scenery, and fighters directly through trapdoors in the arena floor, delivering them into the performance space in a way that was designed for maximum dramatic impact. You were not simply going to walk out onto the sand. You, or rather, the spectacle of which you were a component, were going to arrive, and the machinery beneath the floor was there to make that arrival as theatrically effective as possible. A mainstream historical fact that lands with particular weight in this corridor: the Colosseum could hold somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators depending on the configuration of the seating and the generosity of the crowd estimates, making it the largest amphitheater ever built and one of the largest purpose-built entertainment venues in human history until the 20th century. The building itself was constructed between approximately 70 and 80 CE using an estimated 100,000 cubic meters of travertine limestone, held together partly by 300 tons of iron clamps, and employing a workforce that included both free laborers and prisoners of war. It was, in other words, a monument, not just to entertainment and political generosity, but to the Roman capacity to apply organized human effort to the transformation of the physical world at a scale that remains genuinely impressive 2 millennia later. You are standing beneath it now, and the weight of it, not just the physical weight of all that stone above you, but the accumulated weight of everything that weight represents, is something you feel in your chest rather than think in your head. The hypogeum on a games day operates with a controlled chaos that has a logic underneath it once you stop trying to understand everything simultaneously and start focusing on the specific thread of it that applies to you. There are men moving in every direction with the purposeful efficiency of a workforce that knows its roles. Animal handlers lead their charges through the wider corridors toward the larger holding areas. You hear the animals before you see them, the sounds filtering through the stone in a way that is both abstract and visceral, a reminder that the game's program today includes more than gladiatorial combat. The beast hunts, the venations, will precede the gladiatorial bouts in the day's schedule, and the animals waiting in the underground holding areas for their portion of the spectacle are adding their own atmospheric contribution to the hypogeum's sensory environment. The smell down here is a compound event: stone and damp and old wood and fresh sawdust spread over the floor in the areas where it is most needed, and underneath all of this the organic complexity of large animals in enclosed spaces, and underneath that something older and less identifiable that might simply be the accumulated history of the place, the residue of all the days that have happened in this space before today, compressed into the air by the weight of the stone above. Your designated waiting area is a chamber off one of the radial corridors. where a guard directs you with the efficient minimalism of someone who has directed hundreds of fighters to hundreds of chambers and finds the task as routine as any other logistical operation. The chamber contains a bench, a rack for equipment checking, an oil lamp that is doing its best under difficult conditions, and 3 other fighters in various stages of preparation. One of them you recognize from the Ludus, a veteran named something in the general vicinity of Gallus, who has 4 bouts behind him and who nods at you with the calm acknowledgement of someone who has been here before and found it survivable. The other 2 are from other schools, here for their own bouts in the day's program, and they regard you with the same professional neutrality that you direct at them. The waiting is its own experience, separate from everything that precedes and follows it, with a specific texture that you will remember longer than almost anything else about today. There is nothing to do in the waiting that is useful, which means the mind is left to its own devices, which means the mind does what minds do in the absence of useful occupation. It generates content. Some of the content is tactical, the replay of training, the rehearsal of responses, the review of what you know about your opponent's 2 victories and 1 loss, what those outcomes suggest about his tendencies and preferences. Some of the content is less useful, the imagination's tendency to construct scenarios that are vivid and detailed and uniformly worse than the actual probable outcome. You manage this the way the compound has been teaching you to manage difficult internal weather. You don't try to stop the content generating because trying to stop it is precisely what gives it more energy. You let it move through. You stay with the physical sensations that are actually present rather than the imagined ones that are not yet real. You feel the bench beneath you and the weight of the greaves on your legs and the specific fitted pressure of the helmet on your head and the grip of the parmulus strapping on your forearm. You are here. The here is manageable. The imagined there is not your job yet. Gallus, sitting 2 meters away, is doing something with a small object. A token, a charm, something personal that he turns in his fingers with an automatic, habitual motion that suggests it has been through many waiting room sessions and has earned its place in the pre-fight ritual. He catches you looking and holds it up briefly. A small terracotta figure, worn smooth by handling. The original features softened into a general impression of divine presence rather than any specific identity. He makes a gesture that conveys something in the range of "it helps" and then returns to his turning, and you return to your bench and the waiting continues. Here is the quirky detail that the hypogeum itself provides, once you have the presence of mind to look more carefully at the space around you. The elevator shafts rising from the underground chambers to the arena floor above are operated by a system of wooden capstans, large horizontal wheels turned by human labor, connected through a rope and pulley arrangement to the cages and platforms that carry the loads. The engineering required to coordinate multiple simultaneous lifts, timed to the dramatic requirements of the show above, involved a level of logistical sophistication that modern events management professionals would recognize as genuinely complex production scheduling. The people running this operation were not simply opening cages and hoping for the best. They were stage managing a live performance on a scale that required real expertise and real coordination, and the hypogeum was their backstage, their production office, their technical infrastructure, all of it invisible to the crowd above, all of it essential to the spectacle the crowd experienced. Historians still argue about the full extent of the mechanical capabilities of the hypogeum, specifically about whether the elevator systems were capable of raising large animals like elephants or rhinoceroses to arena level, or whether these animals entered through the arena's ground-level gates, and what the practical limitations of the counterweight systems were in terms of weight and timing. The engineering evidence is incomplete, and the dramatic accounts in ancient sources tend toward the miraculous in ways that are difficult to calibrate against physical reality. What is not in dispute is that the effect on the crowd was extraordinary. The sudden appearance of an exotic animal through a trapdoor in the arena floor, emerging into the light and the noise and the overwhelming sensory environment of a packed amphitheater from what must have seemed like the earth itself, was designed to produce exactly the response it produced: amazement, the pleasure of surprise, the particular delight of an audience that knows it is watching something that required enormous effort and expense to make possible, and is experiencing that effort as entertainment. Above you, through the stone and the elevator shafts and the trapdoors and the sand, this is already happening. You can hear it. A vast, low, irregular roar that filters through the structure of the building like a sound heard through deep water. The crowd. 50,000 people generating collective sound in the way that only very large groups of human beings can. Not a single noise but a weather system, a pressure front of human response that moves and changes and peaks and subsides and peaks again in patterns that correspond to what is happening on the sand above you, but that you cannot see and cannot fully interpret from this distance. The sound is the most disorienting part of the waiting. It is too large and too continuous and too alive to ignore, and it presses against your concentration with the persistence of something that knows it has your attention and intends to keep it. You breathe through it. You return to the bench and the greaves and the grip and the here. You return to these things as many times as they need returning to, which is many times. Gallus has stopped turning his charm and is now sitting with his eyes closed and his hands relaxed on his knees, in a posture that looks like sleep but clearly isn't. His breathing is too deliberate, too patterned, something between meditation and preparation that he has evidently developed over the course of 4 bouts into an effective pre-fight protocol. You watch him with something between admiration and envy, not envy of his 4 bouts, exactly, but envy of the specific competence he has developed in this waiting room, the ability to inhabit this impossible hour with something approaching equanimity. You will develop that, you tell yourself, eventually, if you have the bouts to develop it in. Then a guard appears at the chamber door and says your name, rendered in the particular way that Latin treats foreign sounds, slightly different from the version you have been hearing all your life but unmistakably, unambiguously yours, and the waiting is over. You stand up. You check the parmula strap one final time. You roll your shoulders, feel the familiar weight of the armor settling into its fitted position, feel the sicca in your grip with the curved familiarity that weeks of practice have built into your hand. You think briefly and without intending to of the paulus. You think of the doctor's correction of your wrist angle on the 3rd morning. You think of Marcus's patient consistency as a training partner, and Sextus's wordless gift of beans across the meal table, and the Gaul's absolute inhabited stillness at the far end of the yard. You think of the barley, which was definitely slightly less gluey yesterday. Then you follow the guard into the corridor, and the corridor carries you toward the shaft, and the shaft carries you upward through the stone and the dark and the machinery of the largest entertainment operation the ancient world has ever produced. And above you the trapdoor opens and the light arrives. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once, the full unmediated force of a Roman afternoon in an open amphitheater. The sun and the sand and the noise that is no longer filtered through stone but immediate, surrounding, enormous, and you are in it. The sand is brighter than you expected. This sounds like a small thing, and in the inventory of everything that is happening to your senses simultaneously, it is arguably not even in the top 5. But it is the detail that your brain seizes on in the first second of emergence because it is concrete and specific and manageable in a way that the other details are not. The sand is bright, almost white in the direct afternoon sun, spread in a thick, even layer across the elliptical floor of the arena, raked smooth by the attendants who prepared it before the gates opened. Later you will learn that the sand was sometimes dyed or colored for particular events, and that the word arena itself is simply the Latin word for sand, which tells you something about how central this material was to the Roman imagination of the space. Right now, the sand is what you are standing on, and it is bright, and your eyes are adjusting, and the rest of the world is assembling itself around that adjustment. The crowd assembles first as sound, then as movement, then finally as the overwhelming visual fact of 50,000 human beings arranged in concentric tiers above you. So many people that the eye cannot process the individual and defaults to the aggregate. A vast, breathing, continuously shifting mass of humanity that generates its own weather of sound and heat and collective attention. They are watching, all of them, in the specific way that crowds watch things they have paid and traveled and waited for, with the hungry, invested quality of people who have decided that what happens here matters and have committed their afternoon to the proof of that decision. You are the subject of that watching. The arena floor is larger than it looked from the tunnel, which is a spatial paradox that your brain takes a moment to resolve, the confined approach of the underground passage having created a sense of scale that the open space above it immediately contradicts. The ellipse of sand stretches perhaps 80 meters in its long dimension, and the walls of the arena rise around it in a curve that is both enclosing and vertiginous, the tiers of seating stacked above each other to a height that seems, from the floor, almost architectural in its ambition. The podium wall, the barrier between the front row of spectators and the arena floor, is perhaps 4 meters high, topped with a protective netting or railing that suggests the Romans were aware that the boundary between performance and audience required some physical reinforcement. You are directed to your position on the sand by an arena official, the arena staff who manage the choreography of the games with the practiced efficiency of a company that has been staging this show for generations. You stand at your designated mark and you wait, and across the sand at his own designated mark, your opponent waits also. You see him clearly for the first time. He is not what the imagination produced in the waiting room below. The imagination, in your case, had been generating composite opponents, assembled from the training partners you know and the fighters you have observed and the general category of experienced gladiator that your mind had been building from available evidence. What stands across the sand is a specific person rather than a category, and the specificity is both reassuring and complicated. He is approximately your height, slightly broader in the shoulders, carrying the large scutum with the comfortable ease of someone whose left arm has been doing this for years. His helmet is down, visor closed, the fish crest of the murmillo catching the afternoon sun. He rolls his neck once, a gesture so ordinary, so recognizably human, that it briefly cuts through the strangeness of everything else and locates the two of you in a shared category that the armor and the sand and the 50,000 people have been obscuring. You are both people who trained very hard to be here. This is improbably common ground. The opening ceremonies have already happened. You were in the tunnel for most of them, hearing the crowd response to the processional and the presentations as filtered sound. What remains now is the ritual acknowledgement of the presiding official, the magistrate or editor who is sponsoring today's games, seated in the position of honor at the front of the reserved section, whose authority over the proceedings is both ceremonial and real. He is the person who will make the final decision when the bout reaches its conclusion, if that conclusion involves a defeated fighter appealing for mercy. He is, in other words, one of the most important people in your immediate future, and you are aware of his presence in the way that you are aware of all significant variables, not with fixation but with peripheral attention. A mainstream historical fact that reshapes the popular image of this moment, the famous thumbs up and thumbs down gesture that modern culture has attached to the crowd's verdict on a defeated gladiator, is almost certainly a misinterpretation of the ancient sources, propagated through 19th century paintings and then calcified by Hollywood into apparent historical fact. The actual gestures used by the crowd and the editor to signal their verdict are a matter of genuine scholarly uncertainty. The Latin terms used in sources suggest something more like a closed fist versus a turned or extended thumb, and the precise meaning of these signals and who made them and in what sequence is reconstructed from fragmentary evidence that does not quite support the confident clarity of the movie version. What is certain is that the crowd expressed its preference, loudly and collectively, and that the editor was expected to take that preference into account, though the final authority remained his. The bout begins, not with a dramatic signal or a thunderclap of crowd response, or rather, the signal happens and the crowd does respond, but in the moment itself the beginning feels less like a beginning than like a continuation, the natural next event in a sequence that has been moving toward this point for months. You are moving before you have consciously decided to move, which is exactly what the training was designed to produce. The response preceding the deliberation, the body implementing what it has learned before the mind has time to interfere with commentary. Your footwork opens laterally, the first thing the doctor ever corrected, the movement that has been rehearsed 10,000 times against the Paulus and in the pairing drills with Marcus, the foundational positioning of the Thraic style. You are not moving toward your opponent yet. You are moving around the perimeter of the engagement space, creating angle, reading the way he adjusts to your movement, gathering information. He is patient. This is the first thing you learn about him that the training didn't prepare you for specifically. Not because the doctor didn't warn you that experienced murmillo fighters tend toward patience, but because knowing a thing abstractly and encountering it embodied in a specific person across 3 meters of sand are different epistemic experiences. He turns with you, tracking your lateral movement with small economical adjustments of his shield position and his feet, not committing to anything, not revealing anything, simply maintaining his relationship to you while you establish yours to him. The crowd is watching this preliminary movement with the attention of people who know what they are seeing. This is not a crowd of casual observers. The Roman arena audience contained a significant proportion of people who watched the games regularly and had developed genuine expertise in gladiatorial technique. They could read the exchange of footwork and positioning the way a knowledgeable sports crowd reads the opening exchanges of a match, parsing the information each fighter was gathering and the intentions each was beginning to form. Their collective attention has a quality of intelligent engagement that you can feel even from the floor, not the indiscriminate roar of a crowd that responds only to spectacular moments, but a watchful, participatory attention that rises and focuses as the action develops. You make the first commitment. The Sika hook is the Thrayex's primary weapon and your primary question, not whether to use it but when, and what the approach sequence needs to look like to create the moment where the hook has a viable path around the edge of that large shield. You have rehearsed this sequence against Marcus so many times that the mechanics are in your body rather than your head. You come in on an angle, not straight, never straight against a murmillo, the scutum covers straight approaches comprehensively, and you use the parmula to initiate contact with the edge of his shield, creating a moment of bilateral engagement that is not the target of your attack but the setup for it. He reads it. This is the moment where the gap between training and the arena declares itself most starkly. Marcus, in the drills, read the setup approximately 40% of the time, good enough to keep the training honest, not so consistent that you couldn't make the technique work. Your opponent reads it with the additional processing speed of a man who has been in this situation 3 times before, whose pattern recognition has been calibrated by actual bouts rather than practice sessions, and whose response arrives a fraction of a second earlier than Marcus's response arrives. The hook finds the edge of the shield rather than the space behind it, and you are already moving laterally again before the exchange resolves, which is correct. The doctor's voice in your head, not his exact words but the physical memory of his corrections, adjusting your recovery automatically. The crowd responds to the exchange with a collective sound that you feel in your sternum. Not approval exactly, not disapproval, but engagement, the sound of people whose attention has been caught and who are now fully present to what is happening on the sand. Here is the quirky detail that you could not have appreciated before this moment. The acoustic properties of the Roman amphitheater were not accidental. The oval shape, the tiered seating, the specific geometry of the enclosure were understood by Roman architects to produce a sound environment that concentrated and amplified the crowd's response back toward the arena floor, creating an acoustic feedback loop between performers and audience that intensified the experience for both. The crowd's noise lands on you not as ambient background but as a physical presence, a force that enters the body and affects the nervous system in ways that have nothing to do with conscious processing. Your second exchange goes slightly better. You use a feint, a Thrayex technique that the doctor introduced in your 3rd week of specialized training, a movement that presents the appearance of a committed attack in order to draw the shield response that creates the actual opening, and the feint works to the extent that it produces the shield movement you were anticipating. The hook follows, and this time it finds a better angle, and the tip of the curved blade catches the upper edge of his right shoulder. Not a decisive contact, not the kind of strike that ends anything, but a genuine touch, a score, a moment that the crowd acknowledges with a different sound than before. You have hit him. This information moves through your body in a way that is separate from its tactical significance. A pure sensory fact, the confirmation that the system works, that the training produces what it is designed to produce when applied with sufficient accuracy in actual conditions. The doctor, if he is watching from wherever the doctors watch from on games days, has just received the first real evidence of how his investment in you is performing. The bout continues through a sequence of exchanges that you will later struggle to reconstruct in their correct order, because the experience of them is not linear in the way that memory usually organizes events. It is layered and simultaneous, the footwork and the weapon and the parmula and the crowd and the sand and the heat and the specific quality of your opponent's attention, all of it happening in the same moment, all of it requiring response. This is the state that experienced fighters describe when they describe what the arena feels like at its best. Not the absence of thought, but the supersession of the sequential, deliberative thinking of ordinary life by something faster and more integrated. The body's learned responses and the mind's tactical awareness operating together in a register that ordinary training only approximates. Historians still argue whether gladiatorial combat should be understood primarily as a martial practice or as a theatrical performance, whether the fighters were essentially athletes competing sincerely within the constraints of their discipline, or whether the bouts were in some sense scripted or choreographed to produce reliable entertainment outcomes. The consensus of modern scholarship leans strongly toward genuine competition, pointing to the economic incentives for authentic performance and the evidence of real injuries and real deaths. But the theatrical dimension was real too. The fighters knew they were performing. The training included presentational elements, and the best bouts were those where authentic competition produced the most dramatically satisfying narrative arc. What you are doing on this sand is both things simultaneously. You are competing genuinely, fully, with everything the training has built into you, and you are performing aware of the crowd and their reading of the exchange and the story that the bout is telling from their elevated perspective. These are not intention. They are the same act. The decisive exchange comes in what feels like the middle of the bout but is probably closer to the end. Your opponent makes a commitment, a full advance behind the scutum, pressing you back toward the arena wall, using his weight and the shield's coverage to reduce your lateral options. It is a correct tactical decision, and it would have worked against a less prepared version of you, the version that existed 3 months ago with its soft footwork and its straight weapon instincts and its tendency to fixate on the most alarming thing in front of it. The version that exists now does not retreat straight back. You go diagonal, the movement that the doctor corrected on 17 separate occasions before it became automatic, the lateral displacement that takes you off the line of the advance and puts you at the angle that the scutum's coverage cannot efficiently track. The hook follows the angle, and the curved blade of the Sika finds the back of his shield arm rather than the shield itself, and the contact is real and forceful enough to produce an audible reaction from the crowd that tells you, before your own assessment catches up, that something significant has just happened. He goes down to one knee. Not from the strike alone. The greave on his arm prevented anything worse than a bruise, but from the combination of the strike and the awkward weight redistribution of the advance that didn't resolve as planned. He is down on one knee with his shield raised in the classic position of the defeated gladiator requesting the crowd's verdict. And the crowd is making its decision with the full-throated enthusiasm of 50,000 people who have been given a satisfying narrative arc and are responding to it with everything they have. You stand over him, not in the attitude of triumph exactly, because the doctor trained the performance of the bout as well as its technique, and standing over a defeated opponent requires a specific kind of controlled presence that is neither gloating nor indifferent but something the crowd can read as magnanimous. You wait. This is the waiting that is different from the waiting in the underground chamber. This waiting is public, performed, alive with the crowd's noise and the official's attention and the specific suspended quality of a moment whose outcome is not yet determined. The editor raises his hand. The signal is given. Your opponent lives. This bout, on this day, in front of this crowd, ends with both fighters walking off the sand, which is, statistically speaking, the most common outcome and which is, in this moment, the most welcome fact in the world. You walk toward the exit gate with your Sika at your side, and the crowd's noise around you and the sand bright beneath your feet. And somewhere in the tiers above you 50,000 people are processing a gladiatorial bout into the currency of opinion and reputation and the specific Roman pleasure of having spent an afternoon watching humans be extraordinary at something that costs them everything. Your legs are shaking slightly. No one can see this through the greaves. The gate closes behind you and the noise of the crowd becomes the noise of the crowd heard through stone, which is a different thing. Less immediate, less personal, already beginning the process of becoming memory rather than experience. Your legs are still doing their private trembling, and you let them because there is no one in this corridor who has not had this experience and no one who would think less of you for it. And the trembling is in any case not weakness but the body's honest accounting of what it has just been asked to do and what it has found in itself to do it with. Gallus is in the corridor. He has already fought and won. You learn this later, not from Gallus himself, who is not a man given to narrating his own achievements, but from the arena staff moving through the passage, and he is sitting against the wall with his helmet off and his face carrying the specific quality of a man who has returned from somewhere and is in the process of fully arriving back. He looks at you as you come through the gate. He takes in the fact that you are walking, that your armor is intact, that the sand on your greaves is not accompanied by anything darker. He nods once, with the economy of a man for whom this nod contains everything that needs to be said. You sit down on the floor of the corridor, not on the bench, not because the bench is occupied, but because the floor is what presents itself and the floor is adequate and your body does not currently have strong opinions about surface quality. And you sit there and you breathe, and the breathing is the most important thing you have done all day. The compound physician finds you within minutes, which is the system working as it is designed to work. He examines you with his customary brisk thoroughness. checking the joints, the pressure points, the places where the armor's edges meet the body, looking for the small injuries that the heat and the adrenaline of the bout may have masked. He finds nothing requiring immediate treatment, which he communicates with a sound that is not quite praise but is adjacent to it, the professional acknowledgement of a craftsman who has checked his work and found it sound. He moves on to the next fighter with the same unhurried efficiency. You are intact. This is the first fact of the aftermath, and it is the fact that every subsequent fact is built on. You are intact, and your opponent is intact, and the bout is over, and the thing that existed as future dread this morning now exists as past experience, which is a transformation that changes everything about it. Past experiences cannot kill you. They can only, if you let them, teach you. The return to the Ludus happens in the late afternoon, the fighters being transported back through the tunnel or by cart depending on their physical condition and the Lanista's logistical arrangements for the day. Walking back through the tunnel you passed through this morning is one of the stranger experiences of the day. The same stone corridor, the same amber lamplight, the same dampness in the air, but you are not the same person who walked through it in the other direction. And the gap between the going and the returning is only measurable in hours but feels like something much longer. What you are returning to, and this is the part that takes time to understand, more time than the single evening immediately following the bout, is a changed position in the compound's social world. Not dramatically changed, not transformed overnight into something unrecognizable, but altered in the specific way that things alter when theory becomes practice, when potential becomes demonstrated. You have been on the sand. You have performed in the arena. The compound has a word for this distinction that doesn't translate cleanly but that carries real weight in the hierarchy of the Ludus. The difference between a fighter who has fought and one who has not is a difference that exists prior to and independent of the question of skill. Because skill can be assessed in training, but the sand tests something that training can only approximate. Sextus is waiting in the courtyard when you return, which is not surprising because Sextus is frequently in the courtyard at this hour, but the specific quality of his waiting, the angle of his attention toward the gate, the way he straightens fractionally when you come through it, tells you that this particular evening's courtyard presence has been organized around the fact of your return. He looks at you. He looks at the way you are walking, the walking of someone who has been through something but is fundamentally functional, and something in his face releases that you hadn't known was held. He says something. Through the language gap, through the weeks of accumulated shared vocabulary and demonstrated meaning, it resolves into good. Just that. Good, which contains, in the economy of this man and this place and this relationship, approximately everything. The evening meal is the same barley, the same beans, the same olive oil. It is also, and this is not a contradiction, the best meal you have had since arriving. This is what the day has done to your relationship with the ordinary. Compressed it, made it precious, returned it to itself as something seen freshly. The barley is warm. The beans are present. The oil catches the lamplight in the way that oil catches lamplight, and this small optical fact is genuinely beautiful in the way that genuinely beautiful things are, regardless of whether they are grand or modest. A mainstream historical fact that surfaces now, in the quiet of the evening, the gladiator who survived his career, who earned enough victories, generated sufficient reputation, and either bought his freedom or was granted it by a generous editor or lanista, was presented with a wooden sword called the rudis, the same name as the training weapon you first held months ago. The rudis granted to a freed gladiator was not a functional weapon. It was a symbol, the formal recognition that the holder had completed their service, that the obligation was discharged, that they were free to go. Some freed gladiators became trainers, passing the accumulated knowledge of their careers into the next generation of fighters. Some returned to whatever world they had come from. Some, remarkably, chose to return to the arena as volunteers, because the arena had become the context in which their identity was most fully expressed and the world outside it had lost the resolution it once had. Historians still argue about the psychological and social experience of gladiatorial freedom, whether men who had spent years in the total institution of the ludus, whose entire identity had been shaped by the compound's rhythms and relationships and demands, experienced freedom primarily as liberation or as a more complicated displacement, a loss of the structure that had become the architecture of the self. The question is unanswerable for most individual cases, because the men who could tell us are mostly gone. their inner lives accessible only through the fragmentary and often formulaic language of funerary inscriptions and the silence of the historical record. But the fact that some chose to return speaks to something real about what the gladiatorial life did to and for the people who lived it. You think about the rudis as the evening deepens. You think about the wooden sword that has been in your hand every day for months, the weight of it that is now so familiar it has become an extension of the self rather than an object held by the self. The rudis granted in freedom and the rudis used in training are the same word applied to the same shape of wood in two entirely different registers of meaning. The beginning of the journey and its end, the first weight in the untrained hand and the last weight set down by the free one. Here is the quirky detail that finds you at the end of this day. There is a mosaic discovered in a Roman villa that depicts a gladiatorial bout and records its outcome in an inscription that uses a symbol, the Greek letter theta, the first letter of Thanatos, death, beside the name of the fighter who was killed, and the letter phi beside the name of the fighter who was released. The mosaic is not famous. It is not in a major museum. It is a domestic object, something that sat on the floor of a private home and was walked over daily by people going about their ordinary lives. The names and fates of two men reduced to a decorative record in someone's entryway. The fighter whose name carries the theta was a person with a history and a morning routine and a preference about olive oil quality and a private relationship with whatever divinity he had been addressing at the compound shrine. The floor was walked over and the names were walked over and the world continued, as it does. This is the thing about living inside history. From inside, it does not feel like history. It feels like the barley and the bench and the aching shoulders and the sound of 50,000 people filtered through stone, and the specific way Sextus's face released when you came through the gate, and the trembling in your legs that no one could see through the greaves. The large historical fact and the intimate daily experience are the same event, and neither cancels the other out, and the gladiatorial world contains both in a compression that 2,000 years of distance tends to flatten into spectacle and strip of its texture. The Gaul is in the courtyard as the evening settles, as he often is, sitting at the far end of the space in his habitual stillness, present and private simultaneously. He did not fight today. His next bout is some weeks away, and in the interim he exists in the compound's daily rhythm with the settled patience of someone who has learned to inhabit waiting as fully as action. You watch him for a moment the way you have been watching him since your first days here, still trying to understand what it is that he has, the quality that seems to make him impervious to the anxiety that the rest of the compound manages in various ways with various degrees of success. You think you understand it a little better tonight than you did this morning. It is not imperviousness. That was your first reading and it was wrong. It is not that the difficult things don't reach him, the confinement, the danger, the weight of what this life asks and takes. It is that he has arrived at a relationship with those things that is neither resistance nor surrender but something more like full acceptance, the acceptance that doesn't diminish what it accepts but holds it completely, integrates it, makes it part of the self rather than a foreign pressure against the self. He has been here long enough and has done enough, and has lost and won enough that the boundaries between the difficult and the ordinary have been redrawn in a different place than where they sit for most people. Further out, more capacious, containing more without breaking. This is what the sand does over time to the people who keep returning to it. Not what the popular imagination suggests, not hardening, not numbing, not the protective calcification of someone who has learned to feel less. The opposite, a deepening of the capacity to be fully present to whatever is actually happening, because the alternative, being absent from your own life while your life proceeds without you, has been made unavailable by the simple and relentless fact that on the sand, presence is survival and absence is death. You carry your bowl back to the kitchen and you wash your hands at the compound's water point and you walk to your cell and you lie down on the straw mat and you feel the thin familiar surface of it beneath you and the stone beneath that and the earth beneath that, the whole layered reality of the place you are in and the world it sits inside all the way down. Marcus knocks on the cell doorframe. The guard has left it open this evening, an unusual small grace, and leans in with the expression of someone who has been waiting all day for a specific piece of information and is now ready to receive it. You describe the bout as best you can across the language gap, and he listens with the focused attention of a man filing every detail for future reference. He asks questions that you answer with varying degrees of completeness. He nods at the hook that found the angle. He winces slightly at the exchange where the feint was read. He makes a gesture toward his own shoulder and you nod, and he nods, and this small exchange contains a technical conversation that would take 20 minutes to have in full and takes 30 seconds to have in the shared language you have built between you, which is mostly gesture and context and the particular shorthand of two people who have been training the same material in each other's company for months. He leaves with a final nod that means, good. The same word Sextus used in a different language carrying the same weight. You lie in the dark and the compound settles around you into its nighttime configuration. The breathing and the shifting and the occasional sound of the city beyond the walls proceeding through its own enormous life. The stars are doing their work above the walls. The Milky Way spilled across the dark in its extravagant way, indifferent and beautiful and permanent in the way that only very old light can be permanent. Tomorrow the Paulus is waiting. This thought, which for months has arrived with the quality of a sentence to be served, arrives tonight with something different in it. Not quite eagerness, not quite the settler's comfort of a person who has made a complete peace with their circumstances, but something in the neighborhood of both. The Paulus is waiting and you will go to it, and the doctor will find new things to correct and old things to reinforce, and the barley will be there at sunrise. Dense and earnest and nutritionally engineered for the specific demands of a body that has been given a job it was not born to do and has been, with remarkable willingness, in the process of becoming adequate to it. You are not a Roman gladiator. You have never been further from everything that made you who you were before the straw mat and the locked door and the wooden sword and the curved blade. You are also, in this compound, in this world, in this very specific and unlikely life, more fully present to your own existence than you have been in longer than you can accurately remember. Every sense calibrated, every day consequential. Every small grace of flavored oil or shared beans or a face releasing at a gate carrying the full weight of what it actually is. The sand was bright. Your legs trembled where no one could see. The crowd made its verdict and the editor made his sign and your opponent walked off the sand with you and somewhere in the tiers above. 50,000 people folded the afternoon into the larger fabric of their lives and went home through the Roman evening to their own meals and their own ordinary extraordinary existences, carrying the day's spectacle with them as a story to tell, a memory to keep, a small bright particular thing that the enormous indifferent world had, for a few hours, arranged itself to provide. And now, gently, we begin to let it go. The stone wall is warm from the day's sun, holding the heat long after the air has cooled, and you can feel it against your back, that deep, slow warmth that has nothing urgent in it, nothing demanding, just warmth. Just the patient, generous warmth of stone that has been in the sun and is now giving it back, quietly, in the dark. The compound is breathing. All these lives around you, settling into sleep one breath at a time, the collective rhythm of it like a tide going out, easy, inevitable, carrying everything with it as it goes. You can let yourself go with it. There is nothing left to prepare tonight. Everything that needed doing has been done, and the body knows this, and the mind is beginning to accept what the body already understands. The Paulus will be there tomorrow, and so will you, and that is enough, more than enough. A whole sufficient world contained in those two facts. Tomorrow is not tonight's problem. Tonight has no problems. Tonight is just the mat and the dark and the slow release of everything the day has held, tension by tension, thought by thought, until what remains is only the simple animal fact of a living body in a quiet place at the end of a day that asked everything and found something there to meet it. Let the sand go bright behind your closed eyes, and then let it fade. Let the crowd's noise come up one last time, enormous and alive, and then let it soften, down through all its registers, all its urgency and energy and human warmth, until it is just a hum, distant and kind, like the sound of a city heard from very far away, going on about its life while you rest in yours. The barley was good today. The stars are doing their ancient patient work above the walls. And you are here, and you are whole, and the world is very old and very wide and full, tonight, of nothing but the soft dark and the slow breath and the gathering quiet of a mind finally, gently letting go. Sleep now. Sweet dreams.